myself are here to lecture on the Philadelphia experiment and to go into delta T functions and a delta T generator. We're going to start out by having Al Bielek describe his experiences in the Philadelphia experiment. Al Bielek, who is a retired consultant engineer, is one of the survivors from the Eldridge. He's one of the two men that jumped overboard and ended up in Montauk in 1983. Once Al finishes that, then I will be back to discuss with you the time equations and how to generate a time stress system. And then I will then be discussing the transistor, the delta time transistor, and then we go into the device that I built and that Al has tested. Then Al will discuss what he tested and what he found the device do. So for the Tesla Society, here is Al Bielek.
Thank you, Preston. The Philadelphia experiment, so named because of the fact that in the final days of the testing it took place in the Philadelphia harbor, actually started out much earlier than those days of 1943. It began in 1931 far from Philadelphia or the Institute of Advanced Study in a windy city called Chicago, which was in 1931. And several people got together to do a paper study, what today we call a feasibility study, of whether or not you can make an object invisible. Those people were Dr. Nikola Tesla, Dr. John Hutchinson, who was then Dean of the University of Chicago Engineering Section, and a staff physicist by the name of Dr. Emil Kurtenauer. These three people did what today we call a feasibility study. What do you do to make an object invisible? How do you approach it? And all of that sort of thing. They didn't get very far at first, and it was nothing more than a paper study. And about 1934, the project was transferred to the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. But prior to that, in 1933, it's important to note that the then new President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected in 1932 and took office 20 March 1933. In those days, it was the 20th of March when they were inaugurated rather than, as today, the 20th of January. He already knew Nikola Tesla from prior contact going back to World War I when he, Franklin Delano, was Undersecretary of the Navy and had asked for Dr. Tesla to do some government work in the war effort, which Tesla readily agreed to. So in 1933, Roosevelt invited Tesla to Washington after he was president and in office, in exchange of amenities, my old friend Nikola, what have you been doing, and this sort of thing. And he knew about the project that he was already working on and asked him if he would like to be the director of the project. Franklin Delano had unlimited faith in the capability of Tesla to accomplish anything he put his mind to. Up to that point, Tesla had an impeccable, perfect track record. He never failed, and this was well known. Tesla said, I accept, and of course he went on with the program. Now in 1933, the Institute of Advanced Study came online. It had been in the mill for some time prior to that, and 4 principals were brought on board as the original complement of scientists, PhDs, all of them, who became the staff of the Institute of Advanced Study. Now, I might point out that the Institute of Advanced Study was on Princeton property, but was not connected with the university itself. The only connection was the fact that it was on university property. It was a totally separate entity. The original 4 physicists, mathematicians, and so forth who came on board was a Dr. Alexander, of which I know very little, some man who I think everybody's heard of, Dr. Albert Einstein, Dr. John von Neumann, and a Dr. Oswald Veblen. They were the 4 original staff members in 1933. Now, in 1934, the project was transferred to the Institute of Advanced Study for continuing work, and it was still a study program which had some Navy funding attached to it from the Office of Naval Engineering. Now, in those days, what we today call the Office of Naval Research was called the Office of Naval Engineering, and that name change took place in 1946. So the project went on. There was more paper studies, and they built some equipment. And in 1936, they had their first field test, as you will. They tested in one of the little wooden buildings they had on the property, which if something went wrong and they lost the building, was no great loss. The equipment worked partially. It was not fully successful, but it gave them encouragement. It told them at least they were working in the right direction to achieve what they wanted. So they continued on from that point with more Navy money and some more staff members, and they continued onward with this until 1940. Now, in 1940, they had a fully successful test which took place at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, in which the vehicle was a U.S. Navy tender, approximately 250 tons. And this vehicle had two other vehicles, ships, adjacent to it, one on starboard and one on port, in which most of the heavy equipment was located. And the equipment which directly produced invisibility was on the tender and on long cables. In case something went wrong, they could cut the cables, and if it got totally out of hand, they could sink the ship. And those precautions were unnecessary. The test was fully successful. The ship became optically invisible, invisible to the eye and to a camera. Well, the Navy was elated. Roosevelt was elated. And immediately, of course, the Navy classified the project. From that point on, instead of being a civilian project under control of the university, it was a Navy project under control of the Navy, and it was called Project Rainbow. At that point, of course, all the personnel connected with it had to get a classification, get their appropriate clearances. Offices were set up in the Philadelphia Navy Yard to handle the classified end of the work and the work at the Navy Yard. And, of course, other research, R&D, continued onward at the Institute of Advanced Study itself in Princeton. Now, there's a number of things need to be brought in here. What was the background of some of the people involved in this project? Who was involved with the project? And where did the science and technology come from that made this project possible? Because it was successful. One has to go back quite a ways. The first man of importance, we need to look at his history at least to a certain degree, was Nikola Tesla. He was born in 1856 in Smiljan, Croatia, now part of war-torn Hungary. He was a son of poor parents. His father was a priest. His mother was illiterate, but had some inventive skills in developing things for use around the house. Nikola had an older brother, and this older brother was apparently very much loved by young Nikola. And at the age of 7, Nikola's age of 7, the older brother was killed in a horse accident. It upset Nikola no end for a number of months. But he continued onward. He continued to show an interest in scientific matters, which totally disturbed his father, because his father was determined that Nikola was going to follow in his footsteps as a priest. Well, some years later, in his early teens, Nikola became very ill, actually violently ill, and he was in bed. They expected him to die. His father finally says, "All right, Nikola, if you really want to go to engineering school, I'll consent and let you go to engineering school." Nikola recovered almost immediately and quite miraculously from his illness, finished his high school. In Europe, in those days and today, they called it the gymnasium, which is their term for the high school, and enrolled in the university in 1878. He was there 1 year, formally enrolled, when his father died, and that left him without any funds. So Nikola at that point had to go to work for a living. And he first took a job with the telephone company in Budapest, where he was at for about 2 years. He tried to continue his studies on the side, but he did not have the funds to pay the tuitional fees, and consequently all he could do was monitor some of the classes. In 1882, he went to Paris and went to work for the Continental Edison Works. And after many arguments with his professors over a period of time about AC theory, which he had already developed, he had the concepts in mind before he came to the United States. And these professors were rather hidebound and didn't believe there was anything to the AC theories, which Tesla espoused. So Tesla decided he needed greener pastures, and he decided to emigrate to the United States in 1884. At that time, he prepared himself. He had luggage and all of the usual things, and on the process of getting to London and aboard the ship, his luggage was lost. And he arrived in New York at Ellis Island with 4 cents in his pocket a book of poetry which he had written, a command of some 11 languages. He was a prodigious reader and learner. And most important of all, perhaps, was his letter of introduction to Thomas Alva Edison from the works manager of the Edison Company in Paris. So eventually Tesla, after he was in the U.S., found Edison, was introduced to him. And Edison asked him what he did, what he had to offer, and immediately got into a discussion about power systems, AC power versus DC. Edison, in case the people who are viewing this tape and here also in the audience did not know, Edison was a DC man. Tesla was totally sold on AC, and of course Tesla was convinced that AC was the wave of the future and the only way to go, and Edison was totally against it. Nonetheless, in spite of these initial arguments, Edison told him to report to work the next morning. He says, "I need all the good brains I can find, and you obviously have a good brain. You're well recommended by my works manager." Tesla worked for Edison approximately 6 months, and in that period, he was given a specific assignment by Edison to try and correct some problems, and was told that if he finished successfully this problem and solved it within the time period assigned, that he, Nicola, would receive a bonus from Edison of some $50,000. Tesla finished the project in time. The project actually was to stop the arcing of brushes on some DC motors. Finished the project in time to Edison's satisfaction, and then asked Edison for the $50,000 bonus. Edison more or less laughed at him and says, "Well, you don't really appreciate the American sense of humor." Tesla said, "I most certainly do not," and walked out and went back to ditch digging. Shortly after that, Tesla was picked up by the then president of Western Union Company, who had heard of Tesla's reputation, and decided that he was going to support him, handed him a check for some $35,000 to build a lab and start work on building his AC motors and generators. Now, at the same time, 1884, when Tesla arrived in the United States, the Institute of Electrical Engineers was formed in New York. And it has, as I have checked in the files and records, all of the notes of all the lectures and all of the meetings all the way back to day one. And Tesla was a very popular lecturer at that Institute of Electrical Engineers. He used to lecture on a most regular basis, and in the contents of his work, he eventually decided and was given permission to demonstrate an AC generator system and how it would light the lighting in the hall as compared with the DC. It was rather an instantaneous success, and one of the men in the audience was George Westinghouse, founder and president of Westinghouse Air Brake Corporation. Westinghouse was very interested in what Tesla was doing, took him to dinner at the Waldorf Astoria, and over dinner they worked out an agreement where Tesla would be paid $1 million cash for all of his 20 patents, which were then issued in the United States, and a $1 per horsepower royalty for every horsepower of engine, motor, or generator which was produced. This gave Tesla a great deal of working capital and the means to go on to other things which he wanted to do. So in the results of that lecture, he had his laboratory, he had financial backing, and in the interim period between his arrival in New York and at that time through Edison, he met a rather important person, J. Pierpont Morgan. Morgan was a well-known financier. He was interested in far-out projects, and if he thought it was worthwhile, he would invest his money in it for the intent, of course, of making money. He was introduced to Tesla, and of course he had his own particular little spies and informers, if you will. He knew a great deal about Tesla even before he was introduced to him, about his eccentricities, what he was interested in, and his AC theories. As a consequence of that initial meeting, of course, J.P. Morgan backed him, and this continued for a considerable period of time. Now, in 1889, there was a contest initiated to see who would build the power equipment for a new large hydroelectric power station to be built in the United States at Niagara Falls. Tesla won that contract, much to the disdain of Edison, who wanted it very badly. And, of course, Tesla built the equipment, it was installed, and the Niagara Falls Power Company went online about 1894, transmitting power via transmission lines to Buffalo, New York, a distance of about 35 miles, quite an accomplishment in those days, but of course nothing of unusual note today, because we have a power grid all over the United States and Canada, and these power grids are basically all over the world. Old hat, we would say to us today, but it was a major breakthrough at that time. Additionally, Tesla took out his citizenship papers and became a U.S. citizen in 1889, 5 years after his arrival. And in 1893, there was a major centennial exposition in Chicago, the 1893 World's Fair. Tesla won the contract to provide the power for that World's Fair, which he did. And he also demonstrated at the World's Fair for the first time two-way radio transmission, a radio transmitter and receiver, a completely new device, unheard of at that time. In 1898, at Madison Square Garden, he demonstrated something further, a radio-controlled model boat, and a special boat built for him at Madison Square Garden. In 1889, he went to Colorado Springs with Morgan's blessings, I might add, to do some very basic research, build his famous laboratory and towers, of which there are pictures extant around the society and out in the lobby, and which he wanted to do basic research for 2 years, 1889 and 1900. He did this work. Among other things, he generated 200-foot long lightning bolts, a feat not duplicated to this day, built a huge Tesla machine, did a lot of research, and among those things which he did, he demonstrated the feasibility of transmitting electrical power without wires over a distance of 26 miles to light some rather sizable electric light bulbs. When he finished with his work there, he held a press conference. He announced what he had done, some of his findings, and that, among other things, he had received strange radio signals from some strange place which he assumed was off-planet. This made great press for the newspapers, but was taken with rather a dim view by his scientific colleagues. Nonetheless, he went on. He went back to J.P. Morgan, told them, I can demonstrate to you the transmission of sound and pictures through the air, what today, of course, we call radio and television. And J.P. Morgan's eyes allegedly lit up, and he told Tesla, if you can do this for me, he said, you can have all the money you want. So that began the construction of the Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island, a project begun in 1901 with the intention of demonstrating long-range transmission of radio signals and eventually television. Now, there was an international contest afoot worldwide to see who would be the first to cross the Atlantic, span the Atlantic with radio signals from Europe to the North American continent, at least to the position of Newfoundland, which was where it was successfully transmitted by Marconi in 1902. Marconi, it must be added, had been in Tesla's laboratories back in the 1890s, and at Tesla's invite, he had open sesame to all of his files, and probably learned a great deal about radio from him. Marconi made his announcement of being the first to transmit across the Atlantic, claimed the prize, and of course J.P. Morgan lost some interest at that point in Tesla because Tesla did not succeed in being the first. Tesla had $100,000 from J.P. Morgan to build this tower, and that funding was completed. The tower was not complete. Tesla did complete it with his own money, but did not have enough funds in order to complete the installation of all of the equipment that was required. The tower was never used. It stood vacant until 1917, and because of indebtedness, Tesla sold the tower to Waldorf Astoria Hotel System, and in 1917 they tore it down. The laboratory building that sits next to the location where the tower was is still there intact, though unused today. And the underground installations, which had originally a wooden staircase going down some 60 feet into some underground installations which are part of the tower, probably ground plane connections. The underground facilities are still there, but nobody can go into them today because the stairwells have long since collapsed. The stairways are gone. In any case, Tesla continued during that period of time doing a lot of R&D, and at that point where he announced that he wanted to go to wireless transmission of power, he slowly, but most methodically, was reduced into a non-person. He was erased from the textbooks, He was no longer announced with a great heraldry, which he had been socially accepted all over the country previously, and slowly slid into the position of a non-entity and a non-person. I might say did not slide. He was pushed gently but firmly. In 1917, Tesla was working for the American Marconi Company when he was approached, probably for the first time, by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then Under Secretary of the Navy, asked if he would do some work for the government, for the war effort. Tesla readily agreed and said that he'd be happy to do so, and he became employed by the government. At about the same time, the American Marconi Company was dismantled by the government as a possible hotbed of spies and saboteurs. In 1919, this organization, now defunct, was reorganized into a new operation called RCA, Radio Corporation of America. It went online operational in December of 1919, and most of the engineers from the American Marconi Company, including Tesla, became part and parcel of RCA. Tesla went on board as an engineer and remained with the organization for many years. Eventually he became chief engineer, and in 1935 he was promoted to the position of vice president and director of engineering and research worldwide, a position he held for 4 years until 1939, when he was given his retirement party at Cherry Hill, New Jersey. The government doesn't really want anybody to know much about this, that he was at RCA for 20 years, and you will find little or no references to it today out in the open literature. Basically, 0 references. But this was during the period when he was supposed to be a recluse, living in his little New Yorker hotel room doing nothing. He went on and did many things. In 1931, among other things, aside from the Project Invisibility, he developed and demonstrated wireless power to run an automobile. He converted a Pierce Arrow, took out the gasoline engine, put in an electric engine, allegedly 75 horsepower, developed a black box with tubes in it. That's all anybody knew that was in it, approximately so square, put it in the dashboard of the car when he wanted to go somewheres. And he would drive all over Manhattan and eventually all over New York State, much to the interest and encouragement of the newspapers and to certain people who witnessed it. Nobody knows for sure what happened to the car, but this was in the press for a considerable period of time. In 1935, he developed a particle beam weapon system, which he attempted to sell to various nations, U.S., Britain, and Canada. They all turned him down. When the Russians were offered the system, they bought it for $25,000 cash and a working model, not a full-size one, but a working model. And the records of this were lost during World War II. I have a friend in Phoenix who investigated this and verified through the Russian embassy that, yes, there was such a contract. Yes, Tesla did deliver a model, but it was destroyed during the war years, and we don't really know what happened to it or any of the other information. At least that's what was said. In 1938, approximately, Tesla also developed a death ray system, separate from the particle beam weapon system. This death ray system basically was a laser device, laser-like, with a barrel about 18 inches in diameter and about 4 feet long. It was mounted on top of a specially built tower at White Sands Proving Grounds. And all of the charging capacitors and other power equipment was in this tower, which was quite extensive and heavy. And the target would be put out within range of this device. Basically, they would use an Army truck or an Army tank. They would charge up the capacitor bank, and when they were ready, it would fire much like a pulsed laser, emitting a green light, which would come onto this target, and the tank or the truck or whatever it was would disappear. They even tried it on animals. They all disappeared. Not invisibly, but permanently. Later it was tried on the mountaintop there at New Mexico, and allegedly it bored a hole through the mountaintop, which became just a little too much for the military. The stories I've had are that they became rather terrified with this weapon and decided, after some consultations, to destroy the model and bury the records of what had been done and of the technology behind it. I find it hard to believe that the government would bury completely such a project, but that is the information I have. This was all during the period when Tesla was allegedly a recluse. In between all of this, he was still working on Project Invisibility. Now, in 1940, after much more research, a fully successful test was engaged and this was on a small Navy ship, a tender, in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And there were two ships involved with that test vehicle, one ship on starboard and the other on port side, which held most of the heavy equipment. And through long cables, the actual hardware to produce the invisibility was on the target ship, the tender. No one was on board that experimental ship during the tests, which is quite important. And when they turned on the equipment, the ship became invisible, totally optically invisible, both to eye and to camera. And, of course, the Navy was elated. They said, we have finally a successful test. And, of course, Roosevelt was satisfied. And what did the Navy do? They immediately classified the project, called it Project Rainbow, set up classified offices in the Philadelphia Navy Yard on the top of a building, of which I have slides and we'll show you later. And everyone had to be properly cleared and get their clearance papers and so forth. Research continued at the Institute, but the Navy's part in this, now taking over the project, was run basically from the Philadelphia Navy Yard. There are other people in the background who I should give some sketch work, some small rundown biographically of what their contributions were. Not only was it Nikola Tesla, but there are other people who made major contributions and set the groundwork up for the mathematical and scientific background making this achievement possible. The second man I should go into in his history, I was born in 1863, and that was Dr. David Hilbert, a German mathematician born in Germany, 1863. Got his degree in mathematics, taught in the PhD mathematics degree, taught in the German university system until 1930, retired, and eventually died in 1943. He developed 5 systems of mathematics. The only one which we are concerned with here is the last of those 5, which was sometimes and is usually called Hilbert space, a mathematical means for describing multiple realities. Now, that period of work, which encompassed a number of years, overlapped the period when other people concerned with this project were also in Germany. Now, in 1879, another very important man, I think everybody's heard the name, Albert Einstein, was born in Ulm, Germany. I won't go into his history other than to state that he acquired his PhD in mathematics in the years after the turn of the century. And he worked in the patent office. And he issued his so-called special theory of relativity about 1907, then the general theory of relativity in 1915, at which time he had offers from virtually every university in Europe to come to that university and lecture. He did lecture throughout the German university system until 1930. And at that time, his friends told him, take a look at what's happening here in Germany, and you should be able to see what's going to happen in the near future. It's not wise for you to stay here in Germany. You should leave. Well, they did smuggle him out. As I understand it, the National Socialist Party, of course that was the party of the Third Reich, did not want him to leave. They considered him a national asset, but his friends smuggled him out, brought him to the United States, and he was teaching in California at the Pasadena University, well known as Caltech, and also resided in Pasadena. A friend of mine, now deceased, met him there more than once and knew that he was there and told me about Einstein's 3-year tenure at Caltech until 1933, which at that time when he told me didn't really mean that much to me. But in view of all of the other events since, now has much more meaning. In 1933, he was made an offer to come to the Institute, which he accepted, and he remained there until his death in 1955. The next man of importance was Dr. John von Neumann, born in 1903 in Budapest, Hungary, the son of a rich Jewish banker. He had 2 brothers and a sister. He was almost a genius from birth. He was capable of adding up or multiplying in his head 2 strings of 8 numbers and coming out with a correct answer in his head at the age of 8. Rather a prodigious accomplishment. He took his time getting his education, however. He was in no great rush. Eventually decided he wanted some backup profession, if you will. Took a degree, a bachelor's degree in chemistry in 1925. In 1926, his PhD in mathematics. And he, Dr. von Neumann, also taught in the German university system for 4 years until 1930. During that period, he also met Dr. Hilbert, whom he interfaced with to a great degree, wrote a paper in German on some of Hilbert's work, studied it, and eventually decided to leave for the United States, but not before he met Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, who was also in Germany at that time. Oppenheimer did not figure at all in terms of this project, but of course was in charge of the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project during World War II, which became important to Dr. von Neumann after the Philadelphia Experiment project collapsed. Von Neumann came to the United States in 1930, taught at the Princeton University Graduate School as an adjunct professor. And in 1933, he was made an offer to come to the Institute, an offer he accepted, and was on staff there for many years. Now, in 1909, another very important man to this entire project was born. It's a Dr. Norman Levinson. I can find out very little about him, but I have determined and found from some of his works, he published some 5 books. He was a mathematician, American-born, an assistant professor of mathematics at MIT until 1955, and a full professor of mathematics from 1955 till his death in approximately 1976. There are 5 books in the open literature, which can be located if you search diligently enough. And the most important work, however, was classified, and that is the work he did on the time equations and the time matrix. Absolutely essential to understanding what was being done or was about to be done at the Institute to produce the invisible or invisibility effect, the cloaking, if you will. One other man was rather important to this project, T. Townsend Brown, born in 1912, I believe, in Zanesville, Ohio. He had a fairly checkered career, eventually acquired a degree in engineering, bachelor's degree, and in the Depression years could not obtain much in the way of employment. He enlisted in the Navy with his degree as an officer in the reserve status. And in 1938, he was tapped on the shoulder by the Navy, saying, "You're in the Navy now, and we even have a department for you to head up. It's minesweeping, and we want you to develop some new procedures." The first major problem they handed him was how to cope with the newly developed German magnetic mine. Now, unlike the ordinary mine, which has large spikes on the end of the mine and is floated at a given depth below the surface, contact, direct physical contact, would cause the mine to explode. The new ones were different. They sensed the magnetic field of the Earth, and when they sensed a concentration of magnetic flux due to the approach of a large iron or steel vessel, the internal sensors to this device would say to the mine, a ship is overhead, now is the time to blow up. And would blow up and essentially blow a hole through the bottom of the ship. D. Townsend Brown was given the task of finding a means to explode these devices safely at a distance. And he eventually developed a system that was very similar in many respects to the work which followed on the Invisibility Project, but was not the same. He developed a system of wrapping coils around the hull of a ship. They were driven by very high current pulses from a special generator aboard the ship, and these current pulses through the coil would generate a magnetic field, pulsed, which would extend to a sufficient distance that the magnetic mine would sense a ship was near and blow up at a safe distance, quite safe from damaging the ship's hull. D. Townsend Brown also did make other contributions to the project. He made and designed a special antenna, because he was an RF expert, a special quadriphase antenna mounted on the highest point of the ship, that is the Eldridge, DE-173, in the tests which were conducted on the Eldridge. Now, this only gives a thumbnail sketch. There is much more to be said about these people, but it does show some of the background. And it is important to understand the background of the contributions here in order to grasp what they were really doing. Now, in 1940, I came on board the project, and you might well ask, how did I come on board? How did I become part of it? I was not born Alfred Bielek. I was born Edward Cameron, son of Alexander Duncan Cameron, Sr., 4 August 1916, Bayshore, Long Island. And father at that time was himself a Navy man. He was born in 1891 and died in 1981, 90 years later. He did not, so far as we know, acquire a college education, attended Loyola School in New York, and joined the Navy at some time which we cannot determine because all of those records had disappeared from the family files. I assume from what I can piece together about 1910. We have one photograph of him as being in the Navy and taken in 1917, showing him in his uniform as a bosun's mate first class, and that's in my slide collection, which I will show later. Now, he was a rather prodigious ladies' man, and he acquired a girlfriend, if you will, a live-in woman. I was born of that woman at Bayshore, Long Island in 1916, and Brother Duncan, literally a half-brother, by the other woman he was keeping, who were in Connecticut, and he was born in 1917, May, if I remember correctly. And of course, in 1917, we were dragged into the war in Europe, and the Navy tapped Father on the shoulder and said, "The war's on. You're going to sea at this point." And of course, he was in the Navy. He went to sea, abandoning both wives. And of course, Duncan and I were then left sort of on our own, but since the rest of the family knew what was going on, we were picked up by Auntie Arnold, and we were raised in a big house on Long Island in Islip. So it was a transfer for me from Bayshore, Long Island, to Islip, and for Duncan from Connecticut. Father himself had been raised by Auntie Arnold because my grandfather, his father, died of a gunshot or a gun wound accident in 1896. So he was in turn raised by Auntie Arnold. So we grew up, went through our high school years, and Father, who visited us typically once a year, usually around Christmas for about 2 weeks, insisted that we get a good education. Our family had no lack of money, because the Arnold was of the Arnold Constable Company in New York, a department store chain, which was doing very well. There was a great deal of money in the family. So when we finished our normal high school and schoolwork there, we went to university. I chose to go to Princeton, and Duncan, for whatever reason, chose to go to the University of Edinburgh at Edinburgh, Scotland. He went through the whole 9 yards of his schooling there and took a degree in physics, a PhD, in the summer of '39. And I went through bachelor's and master's at Princeton, and I met at that time Dr. John Van Neumann, who took a great interest in me, and I did not understand why then. But that awareness and understanding came very much later. Well, after both the Philadelphia experiment and the Phoenix projects were over, I finally learned why. But in any case, he suggested it would be much better for me to go to Harvard to get my PhD in physics. It was a better school, etc. So I did. I transferred and took a PhD in the summer of '39 at Harvard. Come September, Father arranged for us to join the Navy. We enlisted in the Navy at 50 Church Street, New York in September. We both took commissions, Lieutenant J.G., went to a 90-day wonder school in the Navy's collection of 90-day wonder schools up in Providence, if I remember correctly. And after that was over, we were assigned to a project. That school was maintained for officers who enlist with an education who would be assigned to a special project. So we were assigned to our special project. We didn't know what we were going into or what to expect. Father, of course, already knew, I'm certain of that. We wound up at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey, part of the Invisibility Project. We thought we knew a great deal about physics. In fact, we thought we knew all about it, as was currently taught. We quickly learned at the Institute that we really didn't know much of anything. The cutting edge of science, of mathematics, and technology at the Institute was decades ahead of what they taught at the school. We learned, for example, that our universe that we live in, the 3 dimensions that we all accept, plus the 4th dimension of time, is hardly a full explanation. There's actually a 5-dimensional universe. There are 2 time dimensions, where we refer to as T1 and T2. I'll get into that later technically. But we learned about that. We learned about the project, what they were attempting to do, how they attempted or were going to make a ship or an object invisible, which involved a manipulation of the time field. We learned that the work here was not totally original. It was in the literature since 1931 about multiple 5-dimensional reality, from the days of P.D. Ouspensky in 1931, who wrote a book entitled Tertium Organum, or A New Model of the Universe. Well, we were brought up to speed. We became part of the project, and of course, approximately September, the successful test, everything was classified. We obtained our clearances, and we continued on with the project. Many things happened from that point on. After the project was classified, of course, the Navy was elated. Roosevelt was elated. And of course, Roosevelt then, knowing Tesla and his impeccable track record, decided that he wanted to give him a somewhat larger ship to work on. He gave him a battleship and told Tesla, if you can make a battleship invisible, you can make anything invisible. So this battleship was tied up in the Philadelphia Navy Yard in the back classified section, and work proceeded on this ship to get it ready for the tests which would have come much later. So at that point, of course, Tesla had to order equipment for a much higher powered level than was used on the tender. Well, this work continued on, and we were with it until January of 1941. In January of 1941, the Navy decided that we had to go into the Navy at sea, and as officers, we had to learn what the Navy was all about. So we were assigned to a ship, the USS Pennsylvania, which went out in the Pacific, and we roamed all over the Pacific for the better part of a year. And we came into Pearl Harbor in October of 1941. The ship went into dry dock, and we took leave and went on to San Francisco. I'll get into the slides in a little bit. With this battleship, he expected, of course, that Tesla would make it invisible and prove his principles. So Tesla went to work and proceeded to order equipment, do his design work, and get the battleship ready. Now, they did not tear their ship apart. It was parked in the harbor of Philadelphia Navy Yard, actually the inner harbor, where the classified work was done. And outfitting was eventually done, but something else occurred at the end of 1940. The Navy decides that Duncan and I have to go to sea to learn what the Navy's all about. So you're going to be assigned to sea for a year aboard the USS Pennsylvania, which was a flagship of the fleet, a battleship, built in 1916, commissioned in 16, I mean to say. And we were assigned from January 41. It was to be 1 year on the Pennsylvania, so we roamed all over the Pacific. There's some other anecdotes I won't go into. But nonetheless, comes October of 1941, the Pennsylvania comes into Pearl Harbor and goes into dry dock for overhaul. So we had some free time, and we went to San Francisco on leave. And of course, we had a ball there. And our orders were cut for the return to Pearl Harbor and to the Pennsylvania on December 5th, 1941. December 5th, we're at the airport, the Naval Air Station, about to board the plane, and orders came through from a captain of the Navy who actually came up to us and says, "Gentlemen, your orders are canceled. Come with me." So we followed him to an upstairs floor of the Naval Station. We were met by Hal Bowen Sr., who was then director of the Office of Naval Engineering. He told us, "Gentlemen, we do not want you to go back to Pearl Harbor. We have reason to believe that within 48 to 72 hours, the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor, and you're much too valuable to us to be sent back there. So you're staying here in San Francisco, finish out your tour time with the Pennsylvania, and you can take leave time as you wish." He said you can do some paperwork. But he says after you return to the Institute, there will be no leave time, and it'll be nothing but hard work, so make the most of it. And we did. January, we returned to the Institute. And of course, December 7th is history. I don't need to go into that. And we then found that in January of 1942, the plans were well advanced and equipment is already built for the test of the battleship, which was slated for March of 42. We were brought up to speed on that, and Tesla was very upset and concerned over the fact that with the amount of electromagnetic power that was required to make a battleship invisible, that he was going to have some very serious problems with personnel. The plan was to have personnel on deck to observe from the deck of the ship what happened and what they could see, and he knew there could be possibly some dead sailors. He had already been advised that this would happen from his, shall we say, radio contacts with the outside, because he was in contact with extraterrestrials from about 1931 onward. That's a separate story, which is really a little too long to go into. But he was advised that there would be a problem, number one, and number two, it was solvable. So he went to the Navy and asked for more time to solve the problem. He says, "I can solve it, and I know there will be one." And, of course, they came back with the typical retort during war years, quote, "There's a war on," unquote. "You have a deadline, do what you need to do, but you will meet that deadline." So Tesla was given a rather unpleasant choice, namely, go ahead with the test and hope everything came out all right, or sabotaged the test in some manner so that the sailors and the personnel were not affected. He chose the latter course, and on the morning of the test, when it was scheduled, he saw to it the equipment was not properly tuned, was detuned, and the only thing that happened was a few transmitter bottles blew up, improperly loaded. And, of course, there was no invisibility field. And he says, gentlemen, the test is a failure. I'm bowing out at this point. I have other things to do. And you have a very good man here who can take over, Dr. John Van Neumann. So immediately, Dr. Van Neumann took over the project. Of course, there is a debate to this day. Did Tesla leave voluntarily, or was he fired by the Navy? We don't know. But in any case, we know he did leave. Van Neumann says, I need time to study this to find out what went wrong. He quickly found out what went wrong. He was no fool, and he knew what Tesla was doing. But he decided to take advantage of the time available to him to do a redesign of the equipment. Now, Tesla was an analog man. This means he believed in continuous waves and continuous modulation waveforms as against what is commonly used today in many communication systems, pulsed mode. He did not believe in it. He did not want to go that route, and he used all analog systems. He had 4 modulating frequencies in the RF transmitters. Now, after I go through the slides, I will get into the theory of what went on with the Eldridge and what they were actually doing. Suffice to say that they had some very powerful equipment to generate a rotating magnetic field and a rotating RF field. The same approach was continued by Van Neumann, the same basic theory applied, but Van Neumann decided to make it a pulsed approach, meaning that instead of continuous waveforms, he would pulse them at about a 10% duty cycle, both the coils for the magnetic field, which meant pulsing the large generators, as well as the transmitters. RF transmitters, regular radio transmitters, except these were a little bit beyond the standard AM radio transmitter because they were operating at a carrier frequency of 160 megahertz. And with the boosters and the new system that Van Neumann developed, they were capable of putting out 2 megawatts each CW. That seems like a lot of power today, but in terms of radar, it is not. And they did have the capability to go beyond 160 megs in those days. The public didn't know it. So Van Neumann redesigns everything, and he does a number of other things. He decides he wants a ship which has been designed from the ground up for this project. So he went to the Federal Shipbuilding Yards in Newark, New Jersey, not far away, and with the Navy's approval, picks a number off the drawing board known as DE-173, and is a destroyer escort, approximately 1,540 tons laden from the Navy's official records, and says, I want number 2 gun turret left unfinished. Just leave a hole there. Leave the interior of the ship largely gutted, not completely, and want rails put in the bottom of the hull so that we can drop heavy equipment in and move it to the center of the ship. And when that work was completed and the ship was built, it came down the ways in September of 1942, went into dry dock. The heavy generators, 75 kVA each, with a motor drive which was 750 horsepower with 2 right-angle gearboxes, very large, massive equipment. A diesel-electric generator to power this equipment separate from the ship's main power. The diesel-electric generator was something of a monster at 8 megawatts. Rather large and rather heavy. And all of this had to be installed in dry dock. This was all installed. The ship in December went under its own power to the Philadelphia Navy Yard and was put in the back section where they outfitted the rest of the electronics. And this process went on, of course, until everything was in and we started tests in 1943, early 43. But one other item is of interest here, and that is that both Van Neumann and the Navy decided we needed a volunteer crew for this operation that was possibly hazardous. So they went throughout the Navy starting in July of 42 and asked for volunteers for a special project, somewhat hazardous perhaps, hazardous duty pay applied, and they got volunteers, approximately 33 enlisted men, and there was 6 or 7 officers. In September of 42, they were trained at the Coast Guard Academy at Groton, Connecticut, if I remember correctly. And the man who was the, shall we say, the schoolmaster and head of this class, and I have the picture of it to show you, was none other than my father. The class graduated in December of '42, and they were shipped across to the Navy Yard awaiting orders, and they remained there until they were put on board ship. Along about March, after much preliminary testing, Van Neumann, after Duncan and I were talking with him extensively, telling him that Tesla was afraid of problems with the personnel, decides, yes, there might well be a personnel problem. I'm going to see what I can do about this. And he decided to add a third generator to produce a counter field around the main field. Now, we'll have to show this to you on a blackboard after a bit, what this meant, what the theory involved, and what kind of a field they actually generated. For the third generator, they could never synchronize. It took special electronic circuits to synchronize the first two, because with the size of the gearboxes and the mass of those generators, the only way it could be done is by electronic means, and it was accomplished. The third generator never synchronized with the first two, so sometime in May of 1943, a technician who was assigned to us, a man by the name of Jack Lewar, not DeLewar. DeLewar is for DeLewar Laboratories in England. He was assigned to us as a technician. Sometime in May, that third generator went out of control. It zapped him with a huge charge of energy. He wound up in a coma, went into the hospital, and 4 months later he recovered. He took a medical discharge from the Navy, and he didn't turn up again until a short period of time ago, roughly 2 years ago, and that's part of the latter end of the story. In any case, he was off the project. Van Neumann knew the third generator would not work, so he scrapped it and went back to his original approach, and he was in the position of scratching his head and being a little bit fearful about what might happen. Because you consider the fact that you have 4 RF transmitters, each capable of putting out 2 megawatts continuous wave and pulsed at 10% duty cycle, theoretically capable of 20 megawatts pulse power, peak pulse power each. They didn't go that high, but they had the capability. Plus the rotating magnetic fields. You had a system here which was essentially guaranteed to cause neurological disturbance, if not worse. Up to that point in known history, no one had ever attempted to produce rotating fields of that power and then deliberately subject personnel to them. But that is what was done. How did that come to pass? After the preliminary sea test for the ship, it was seaworthy. They wanted to be able to go to sea immediately if it worked. They had all tests completed for the preliminary systems and subsystem tests, and they decided on July 20th they were going to have the full-blown test for the Eldridge, with the test crew aboard, and Duncan and I being trained to run the equipment in the hold. And I'll show you where in the hold from the pictures. They scrubbed it till the 22nd for reasons of weather and other factors. And at that time, on the 22nd, they had their tests. The test crew was aboard, and we were given instructions by radio to actually proceed with the test. Now, there were no computers in those days. Consequently, everything had to be done manually. Of course, today we have computers, and you could do it by computer control. No such luxury then. Van Neumann didn't invent the computer till later. So we turned the equipment on, and for about 20 minutes, as observed by the observing team on a neighboring carrier, everything was successful so far as they could tell. The ship became invisible to sight and to radar. And after 20 minutes, the man who was in charge of the test crew and the observer crew, as a Captain Harrison, now deceased, noticed something which he didn't like. He was on the deck of a carrier, which put him in an advantage to look down around the size of the ship, or where the ship should have been. And knowing the size of the carrier, he saw a huge waterline, much larger than the ship, and he couldn't find the bottom of that waterline. It was like there was air there, and the ship, though invisible, was probably floating in air, was his conclusion. That was not the truth, but nevertheless that was his fear. He ordered the test the demonstration and test cut off at 20 minutes. The ship was returned under its own power with its own crew to dockside, and then we found nothing wrong with the ship, but that we had a personnel problem. Those personnel deliberately stationed on deck to observe what happened while the ship was invisible were all nauseous, disoriented, totally out of it, as we said, and mentally and neurologically very disturbed. So the Navy said not to worry, we have another crew. Of course, the other half of the test crew were volunteer crew, And von Neumann then knew he had a very serious problem. So we all got our heads together and scratched, and what are we going to do? And the Navy says, he asked for more time to study the problem. The Navy said, well, we'll allow that you only have to make the ship radar invisible. We do not need physical invisibility to the eye or the camera, because in those days there were no navigational systems, no satellites, no low-end, no shore-end. They were dependent on either radar or line-of-sight optical viewing of an adjacent ship in a convoy. And if the radar was blocked out, then they had to be able to see where that ship was in a severe storm where they might ram each other in a convoy. It didn't really help much. And a few days later, the Navy comes up with this famous order: you shall complete your test by the 12th of August, 1943, or forget it. That was a drop-dead date, as we called it. And we all scratched our heads. Why? I went to Halborn. I says, what is this all about? And he says, I don't know. I was given the order. I'll see if I can find out some more about it. It came from the actual CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, who was then Admiral King, as an order. But why should he be concerned about an engineering test when he is primarily concerned with the operation of the war and the operation of the fleet in all theaters of operation, European, Pacific, wherever? Nevertheless, he was the authority for this order, and we figured it came from on higher, which it did, but we didn't know that then, and we didn't find this out until many years later, meaning literally after the Montauk project was over, which says in 1986, 87, we finally found out what this meant. Nevertheless, we were stuck with this date. We tried to make modifications, and we did make some as per the Navy's request. And of course, Captain Harrison wanted to make a few tests of his own. Yeah. In view of what that's more like the original, the other one. In view of what he observed of the Eldridge in the first test, namely a very far out water line, and he could not see the bottom where the water line resumed under the ship, he decided to outfit the Eldridge with pressure testing systems and devices, hydrostatic readout devices on both the inside and outside of the hull, a secondary crew to make measurements of the actual hydrostatic pressure and hull pressure, and he had to his command a submarine which would then go under the Eldridge and see where the water really was and what was going on. So we had two crews on board the Eldridge and a submarine available. And at the last minute, at the morning of 12 August 1943, some kind of problem developed. Didn't like to call it in the Navy a glitch. And they pulled that secondary crew off the Eldridge, put them on the sub, moved the sub out of the area, and then said, we can go ahead with the test. So naturally, Duncan and I were there scratching our heads and standing by the rail before we got our final orders to proceed, wondering what the blazes was going on. We're very apprehensive. We knew something was wrong, but we had no idea what. We didn't have too long to find out. The orders came about 1000 hours can proceed with the test, so we turned all the equipment on as per the new protocol. And for the first 60 to 70 seconds to the observers on that carrier, as well as two other ships now available, a cutter and a commercial vehicle known as the SS Furiaseth, a merchant marine ship, it appeared to be going normally. The ship was radar invisible, but you could still see it through a haze, a greenish haze, not pink as per the movie. And they were watching the ship in the rotating fields, and what appeared to be something rotating anyway. And all of a sudden there was a blue flash and the ship disappeared, waterline and all. There was no waterline. They knew the ship was gone. And at that point everybody panicked, including Dr. von Neumann. Where is the ship? What happened to it? They could not raise anyone by radio. It returned approximately 4 hours later to the same location in the harbor. And they knew immediately something very bad was wrong because they could see that the special antenna designed and installed by T. Townsend Brown for the radio transmitters, it was a special quadriphase antenna, was broken. A piece was missing. There was some minor superficial damage to the ship, and they saw people milling around, almost running around on the deck in a totally incoherent manner, and they could raise no one by radio. So they ordered a launch and a special boarding crew. They went on board the Eldridge, and that's when they found there was a very, very serious problem. 2 sailors were buried in the steel deck, dying. They didn't live long. They were molecularly bonded with the steel. 2 more were upright in a bulkhead in the same condition. One of them was our younger brother, Jim, who decided when World War II started with the Pearl Harbor that he would enlist in the Navy and join his brothers. And he wound up, after his training, becoming part of that special volunteer crew, and he was assigned to detail number 2, namely aboard the Eldridge on the second pass. And there he was dying. I'll get into what happened in a moment. With that whole scenario, the Navy says, well, we could not get any coherent communication through, so the Navy put on a special crew to bring the ship aboard, bring it around, and after they were on board, they brought it around to the dockside where it normally was stationed, took everybody off, and held 4 days of hearings as to what went wrong. I was there, Duncan was not, and eventually was asked to give my testimony, and I told them what happened. I will get into that shortly. And they didn't believe me, but nonetheless, after 4 days of this, they decided, well, maybe we'll risk one more test on the Eldridge. Ripped that burned-out equipment out, put in fresh equipment, because they'd already built some 9 or 10 sets of spares, expecting full success, and they wanted to outfit a number of ships immediately. And late October, on 1,000 feet of cable, when the ship was on station in the out-of-harbor of Philadelphia, at about 2200 hours, that's 10 o'clock at night to landlubbers, went on 1,000 feet of cable and no one on board the ship because they removed all personnel after it was on station. They flipped the switches in the proper sequence. The ship disappeared, came back some 15 or so minutes later, and the hold where the electronics equipment was for the invisibility effect was a smoking ruin, and some of the equipment was missing. At that point, the Navy washed their hands. The entire project said, strip this equipment off the Eldridge, re-outfit it for normal wartime service, which they did. And approximately January 44, it went out to sea and served in the Navy service until 46. The Eldridge was then mothballed, went into mothball someplace in the U.S., and in 1951 it was resurrected with some other ships given to the Greek Navy in an exchange program instituted by President Truman, and it became known as the Leon in the Greek Navy. And we have found out quite recently it is still in the service of the Greek Navy to this day. And they've had a few strange problems. We might go into them later. But it's still alive, so to speak, and still well, if that's the proper term. And it is in the service of the Navy. Let's take a short break here, then we'll get back into what really happened and take it from there, and with the slides.
Can you try to get rid of one mic? Laryngitis, it's working, but not that well.
Okay. If everyone's ready, we will continue. Is the camera ready? So the final test was a failure. The Eldridge eventually wound up in the hands of the Greek Navy. They've had a few problems with it. If we have time, I'll go into it, but we don't now. We need to go back to the point where in the control room, Duncan and I turned on all the equipment. Everything seemed to be normal for approximately 30 seconds. And then we noticed things started to arc over. High voltage arcs were their equivalent, and there was nothing in that control room to contribute to some 10 or 20 or 30,000 volt equivalent arcs. So we knew something was drastically wrong. It first started showing by the banks of electron tubes wavering. There was some 3,000 6L6s to drive the 10 field coils on the 2 generators, 5 each. And as this phenomena increased, and we could raise no one on the radio because we had a receiver in the control room and a direct link to the transmitter, we could raise no one, we heard nothing, we knew we were on our own. So at that point, with conditions getting worse, we decided it was time to shut off the equipment. We tried. We went to the main power switches. They were totally frozen. We couldn't move them. So the conditions continued to get worse, and we decided, let's get out of here. Opened the bulkhead door, ran out on the deck, and at that point, we saw our personnel milling around in a very strange manner. No one was buried in the deck at that point. We should emphasize that. But we had the bright idea, let's get out of here, let's jump overboard and swim ashore. Now, beyond the railing, we could see nothing. It was just a grayish mist. But we decided we wanted out of here, so overboard we went. We never hit the water. We started feeling a funny sensation and falling. And we fell and we fell. We thought like we were going through a tunnel, and it didn't seem like a tunnel, and we didn't know what was going on. But we were falling much too long. And in a period of time which subjectively seemed like 1 to 2 minutes, we suddenly found ourselves standing on dry land at nighttime with our backs to a chain link fence, which we immediately recognized as a military fence, undoubtedly a military establishment of some kind. Suddenly there was a bright light overhead, a blinding searchlight, and it was on a helicopter. We didn't know anything about helicopters because in 1943 helicopters were still being researched as experimental vehicles by D. Seversky and others. But there was this helicopter, a blinding searchlight. The next thing you know, MPs come out from nowheres, grab us, take us to one of the buildings on that base. The door opens, an elevator. We were put on the elevator, and they go down with us. There were levels. The door opens, and we see in this underground chamber, which was rather large, military personnel all over the place, and an elderly civilian who walks up to us and introduces himself to us. Says, "Gentlemen, I've been waiting for you. I'm Dr. John von Neumann." And we look at him and say, "You're who?" I said, "I'm Dr. John von Neumann." "Can't be. We left him about an hour or so ago, and he's a much younger man." I said, "No, I'm sorry, gentlemen. I am the same von Neumann you knew in 1943. You are not in 1943 anymore. You're in 1983 at Montauk, Long Island, and you're part of the Phoenix Project. Welcome." Or something to that effect. We were stunned. We thought he was nuts. But in the subsequent time, which was about 12 hours, we spent most of it in the underground, he gave us a grand tour. And when you see modern computers, hard disk drives, graphic displays, large screen color television, none of which existed in 1943, and then sit down and watch color television for a while and see commercial ads for 747 jet aircraft and discussions about man on the moon and the last trips up to the moon, the Apollo trips, et cetera, and views of freeways in modern cities, we quickly got the idea that something was drastically wrong. And we finally had to accept the fact that I guess maybe we did travel in time and wind up in 83. Then von Neumann springs it on us. He says, "All right, gentlemen, we have to send you back to the Eldridge." We look at him and says, "Now, just how are you going to do that?" He said, "That's no problem." And we looked at him very strangely. He says, "We have complete control over space and time at this facility. We can send you anywhere as we want at any time we want." And he says, "You have to go back to the Eldridge and destroy the equipment." He says, "We cannot shut it off from here. And the problem is that the energy it's creating is feeding a hyperspace bubble which is growing. He says it will not stop just by shutting the transmitter down at this end. That one has to be shut down because it's feeding the bubble. So you're going to have to go back." So we finally said, okay. They did send both of us back. We landed on the deck of the Eldridge, went back in the control room, and he said, "Destroy the equipment by any means available." We found axes as the most ready means available and started smashing equipment. We took out a lot of the 6L6s. We took out other pieces of equipment, cut power cables, and eventually the main generator started to wind down. At that point, we knew it was over. So at that point, we went back out on deck. There was still a gray haze beyond the railing. At the railing, you could see everything on the ship reasonably well. There was a haze on board the ship also, but it was not like what was beyond the ship. And there, not only were people running around in an insane manner, they were insane, but we saw 2 men buried in the deck, and then 2 more buried in the bulkhead right near where our entranceway was to the control room. One of them I recognized as Brother Jim. He was crying. His head and shoulders were out of the steel. Most of them were buried head to foot. So I went over and put my arm around him to try and comfort him, and Duncan took one look at this, looked at me in a strange way like, well, aren't you going to follow? And jumped overboard before the fields collapsed and disappeared. As we found out much later, he wound up back at the Montauk Project in a time period somewhere between 82 and 83. And as again subsequent records showed, and the whole history we've had to research over many years, he worked there for a period of time, ran into a problem where his time locks were lost, and this I will get into very shortly, but when losing the time locks, he aged very rapidly at the rate of about a year, an hour. He was aging very rapidly, and any efforts they could make to try and slow down this process didn't really work. So there they had a problem. They couldn't allow him to die. The aliens knew this because the Montauk Project had many aliens as well as the humans. And I was told to go back and find Father and tell him, because I was working as our Bielek at Montauk at that point. Don't confuse this with Ed Duncan. I will tell you what happened. Go back, find Father, tell me how to make another son. He remarried his 5th wife, and first a daughter, then the son known as, again, Alexander Duncan Cameron Jr., the second, if you will, was born in 1951. And he grew up at the age of 12. The real soul of the original Duncan was placed in that body. And there is marked changes took place in terms of his character, his personality, noted by his mother at that time. He had a great deal of interest in academia, had excellent records in school, typically all A's. At that point, immediately changed to D's and E's and F's, if you will. He became a happy-go-lucky kid, had no interest whatever in academia. His mother, in desperation, put him in a private school. I'll go into that later, but he did graduate from it. So Duncan was reborn. He was not at the Board of Inquiry. I was. And basically what I told them at the Board of Inquiry, and Dr. von Neumann in particular, was what happened, what I saw going into the future and so forth. Nobody believed me, including von Neumann. Von Neumann 43 didn't believe I went in 83, and we in 83 didn't believe that was the same von Neumann for 43. So we had an interesting paradox. In any case, von Neumann says, I want to see you later. So I went to see him later after this little inquiry was over. He says, all right, I guess I'll have to build a time machine. And I'm going to send you back to that period where you were, and you were going to get proof of some kind to convince me that I was really there and this really happened as you described it. He built his time machine in the lab because in the lab he was not under control of the Navy. He was in control of the Institute, and he did it secretly. There was very little change or difference in the technology from what we were using for invisibility to actually travel in time, and I'll explain that shortly. In any case, I went back to the future. I made several trips, really. Finally brought back adequate proof to convince him that I had been there, and yes, he was there in 83. And eventually he wrote his final report, which of course was available to von Neumann in the 80s, and so he knew what had already happened and was going to happen, and he had to be there. But in any case, the project crashed. I remained in the Navy until 1947, but what happened in the meantime is also of interest. Von Neumann, of course, became heavily involved in the atomic bomb project to Los Alamos, which the decision was made, of course, to move the research for the program to Los Alamos in January of 43. And in July of 43, they started the first constructions. In October of 43, von Neumann made his first trip up there. And he was there as a consultant. He was not there full time. And, of course, J. Robert Oppenheimer was the director. And he knew von Neumann very well. So long in 44, I might add, in 43, I had a little problem. I was quarantined like all the other personnel for approximately 6 months by the Navy. You can't see anybody off base. So I was not allowed to see my girlfriend, who was pregnant. And I wanted to marry her. The Navy said, yeah, you can talk with her on the phone. once a month maybe, or something like that. I went to Van Neumann. I said, look, I don't want a child born out of wedlock. Can you do something to arrange a marriage? He said, yeah, I think I can handle it. So we set it up at Princeton University at the Princeton Chapel. I was married there in late 43. In February 44, a son was born, christened Jess Cameron. Today he's known as Jeff Cameron. And in 44, Van Neumann made the suggestion that I be moved up to Los Alamos to work with him on the project. The Navy was delighted with the suggestion because they didn't know what to do with me. They didn't want to send me to sea. I knew too much about the Philadelphia experiment, and they were trying to bury the thing. It was sprouting out all over the Navy with all of the scuttlebutt of what had happened. So I went to Los Alamos in July of 44, worked more or less on the project, primarily as a technical writer, and they wanted somebody that knew all the physics and could write decent technical reports, progress reports for the Navy and for others. And I remained there till 47. Family was with me. And in July 47, I had been warned that there was something coming up that was not healthy, that I was in trouble of some kind. So on July 4th, 1947, while at a picnic in the family, Navy MPs come up to me and go through the formality of identifying me. You're Commander Edward Cameron? Yes, I am. Well, you're under arrest. I said, what? I said, you're under arrest. I said, what's the charge? He says, espionage. I said, that's ridiculous. He says, I'm sorry, we have the charge, we have to arrest you. So they separated me from the family with a tearful goodbye, and I never saw either of them again. Took me down to Albuquerque in one of the famous Navy buses, put me on a train to Washington, D.C. I expected a full court-martial for such charges. Charges were dropped. There was nothing but a ploy to get me out of there. A short time later, a few days later, I was given a new assignment. The Navy brass told me that I was going to Fort Hero on Long Island and that there was a Navy base there. I said, okay. I didn't know at that time that Fort Hero, Long Island, was exactly the same location of the Montauk Project at a future time. So out to Fort Hero I go. I'm there a short period of time. I'm told to stand in the middle of this famous circle, which I will show on the slides, and surrounded by some 75 MPs with drawn weapons who said, don't move. I didn't. Suddenly I was not there in that circle anymore. I was back in the labs underground of Montauk in 1983, sometime in that period. Exactly when, I don't know. And Van Neumann was there, rather tearfully says, I don't like what they're going to do with you. He says, I have no control over this. I'm only a consultant. I said, what they're going to do is strip you of your memory, reduce you to the size of a very young kid, what I understand, and send you back into the past, into another family to start life over. He says, I don't like it, but I can't do a thing about it. So they put me, and I do remember this, and it took a long time to get the memory back, they put me on a standard operating table type gurney, strapped me down, put me in this huge machine where the cylinder walls, there was an outer and an inner wall, transparent. The inner one was about that diameter, the outer one a little more. And wound inside of it, as I remember, there were 3 or 4 ribbons of metal with cables connecting them to electronics on the walls surrounding that room. The walls were covered with electronics. I was put in the gurney, put in this tubular arrangement. The next thing I know, all memory's gone. And I just have that strange feeling like people sometimes have when you wake up in the morning and don't really know who you are or where you are. And the identification of you or who you are and so forth comes back a few seconds later. Well, I was in that interim period where you don't remember anything, but you know you're alive type thing. And suddenly, that was gone. And my next memory, again, it took years afterwards to recover this, and I mean back about 1988. I'll cover that. I remember being at a Christmas party with my then-known parents, the only ones I've known for 60 years, namely Mrs. Albertina Bielek and her husband, Arthur E. Bielek, sitting on Mother's grand piano next to the little Christmas tree. The little Christmas tree was about that high, and I was sitting next to it, and there was the family gathered around exchanging presents. And I was understanding virtually everything that was being said, which is not normal for a kid supposed to be 1 year old. Not everything, but in any case, that was all I knew, the only memories I had for many years. I grew up, went through the normal schooling, Went to high school, went in the Navy again as an electronic technician, 45, 46. No memory of what had passed previously. Left, went on my own business, which eventually did not turn out very successfully. Went to school, had an engineering degree in 1958. I became a practicing electronic engineer, both consulting and on a permanent status, though most of my assignments were as a consultant. Remained in that category from 1958 till 1988, still not remembering anything of what had happened. Now the story gets rather strange from here on, because in 1985, well, let me rephrase that, it gets stranger yet. In 1985, having been a member of the USPA for many years, that is United States Psychotronics Association, I went to their annual meeting in 1985 at Dayton, Ohio, and Preston Nichols was there. I had already met him 2 years prior in '83 at Portland, Oregon, and he had a new assistant, a man by the name of Duncan Cameron. I didn't know him from Adam at that point. And in the process of the convention, demonstrating some of Preston's new sound equipment, and sensing that this guy was a real sensitive, I decided I had to corner him in the cafeteria one day and talk with him. So I did. We sat down and talked for about 2 hours. In the first half hour, after the first half hour passed, I had this strange gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. Where do I know this guy from? This went on for over an hour, and finally I asked Duncan, I says, Duncan, do you have a strange feeling that possibly you know me from somewhere else? He said, yes. I said, do you have any idea where from? He says, not the faintest. He said, well, I got the same feeling, but I have no idea where from. By the time the convention ended, I assumed at that point that my recollection of having known him was from a past life. That was half the story. The rest of it came later. But I also had an invite to come out and visit Preston in his laboratory at Long Island sometime. He said, we're looking for good engineers, and we might want to employ you. I said, okay. A month later, I took that trip to Long Island, and I was taken out to, in the process of the 2 weeks I stayed, to the extreme eastern tip of Long Island, where Preston says, I know you two have never been here before. Ho, ho, ho. I'll show you the pictures of what we were confronted with in a couple of minutes. And we were given by Preston the cook's tour of Montauk, the old air base, Montauk Air Force Station, and we both sensed something terrible had taken place there. We didn't know what. We knew it was not anything we wanted to be too familiar with or engaged in, and both Duncan and I sensed that some huge monster creature had wandered around this place at one time, and we both decided we would not like to be there at night. Nonetheless, we made that trip. I went back to Phoenix, and of course, Duncan with Preston made several trips in the interim. I kept in touch by phone, and eventually, in May of '86, I made another trip out to Long Island, made a number after that, and eventually moved to Long Island in August of '86. But in May of '86 was important because that was my second trip, and in the interim, having talked with certain people who were unknown to me at the time, one of them was the nephew of Senator Barry Goldwater. That said nephew told Barry Goldwater what I told him about this strange site and all this derelict electronics and everything that was there, because the base was wide open and you could wander anywhere and see all the old equipment. Went to Goldwater, and the next thing we know, these three people I had talked with in December of '85 are there in May of '86 on a special commission to investigate the base for the possibility that government funds had been diverted from standard government projects to an unauthorized project by one or more major aerospace corporations. Because in the investigation, Goldwater could find no basis whatever for how that base existed, other than the fact that it was a retired base from 1969 held by GSA as a surplus base. Yet all of this equipment was there. Obviously a project had taken place, and they could find no traceability. Well, in that period of May '86, my memories of Montauk started to come back. Preston gave the lecture Friday on Montauk. I won't go into that. And nonetheless, over the following months and years, more and more came back of Montauk, but not yet of the Philadelphia experiment. I knew I was heavily involved in Montauk. The mechanics of how it happened I won't go into, but nonetheless, I knew I was. January of 1988, I was still working. One Saturday night in Phoenix, I was watching HBO at about 4 o'clock in the morning, about to retire, when they announced the next feature movie of the evening will be The Philadelphia Experiment. So up go my rabbit ears as well. I've never seen this movie. I've not seen it in the video. I've got to stay up and see this thing, because I had had an interest for decades in the Philadelphia Experiment, a very avid interest. Didn't really know why up to that point. So I watched the movie. The first 10 to 15 minutes, the introductory part, was quite accurate. And at that point, it hit me like a bomb, and I knew I was involved, but I didn't know which one of the two principals was me. Initially, I thought I was the better-looking guy, which turned out to be Duncan. The scrawny runt wearing glasses intermittently who had the pregnant girlfriend was me. They didn't have a good role model, but nonetheless, eventually it came back, and I remembered I had a family, I had a son, and that Van Neumann was the project manager. And it also came back to me at the same point that Van Neumann, at some point, had made an agreement with me, and I don't know when this was made, that when I finally remembered the Philadelphia Experiment and my involvement, that he would get in touch with me within 72 hours. He tried to contact me by phone in 48. But unfortunately, he did not have my phone number. Preston did, but we couldn't connect through the office and through various complications, and I never did get to talk with him at that time, but later. He is still alive today. That's another long story. But in any case, my memories came back, bits and pieces, and more and more. And eventually I realized I was heavily involved in that project and recovered the memories of my family. Now, let's go into the history with some slides and bring you up more or less to date on this, and then get into the theory. So if I can have some slides, and where did the remote go? Okay, we're on slide number 1. Now, my memories came back in 1988. But in the end of 88, my legal mother, Mrs. Albertina Bielek, died. I had a small inheritance. And I decided in 89 to go investigate back in the old places which I felt were probably familiar to me, because more and more I remembered where I'd been, including Princeton. So I went back there, and at least pictures are not in chronological sequence. I think they're quite, evoke the story quite well. I went back there and I found, of course, many things, and this picture is of Fuld Hall, which was the administrative headquarters for the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies. Actually, the institute is totally separate from the university and has no connection other than being on university property. They built this hall and dedicated it in 1939. Originally, it held all the classrooms and library, etc. Today, it's rather more diverse. Now, the original 4 people who signed on in 1933, these pictures were taken from a documentary, and they're not too sharp, but nevertheless, that was Dr. Alexander as he appeared sometime in the 40s. Dr. Einstein, I think everybody recognizes him in one of his more famous poses with his pipe and his bushy hair. Dr. John Van Neumann, taken in 1926 in Germany before he came to the U.S., a much younger picture of him than is normally seen. And Dr. Oswald Veblen, whose history I don't know much of as to what happened to him, but he was one of the original 4 who signed on. Many other people came on board as time went on because there were additional projects. And Dr. Hilbert, never part of the project there directly, but I found this picture and threw it in, a very proper, austere German, and just added it for interest because he was such an excellent mathematician. He had an enormous reputation in Europe. This is a library at the Institute. I wandered through there, and that's the first place I was actually able to locate any of Norman Levinson's books, and they were on the shelf. And if you can see in the background, there's a portrait of Einstein, and in the foreground, someplace, there is a small bust of him. But the books are arranged in an unusual manner, alphabetically, not by the normal library code numbers. And this was in the courtyard. I took a few pictures here. It's the second oldest university in the United States, very well maintained, very elegant, and of course very well funded. so they can maintain it. And in this courtyard, I found this pine tree, quite old, quite beautiful. It's nothing to do with the experiment, but I thought it was a nice picture, so I took it. And of course, it was there during that period. One of the study halls, where I had been more than once, it was very, very familiar to me. Notice the mahogany walls. This is the type of treatment they did at Princeton. Great deal of money can buy very nice surroundings, and of course they are very pleasant surroundings, very, very good academically. And this was the famous chapel where I was married in late '43. I never did get inside of it to get pictures of it, interiorly. The lab building where we did much of our work leading up to Project Invisibility, classified Project Rainbow in 1940, was this one. There was an earlier building, and pictures of that. But most of the work was done here. Today it is nothing more than a series of rooms for PhDs doing postdoctoral studies. The lab has been turned into a woodworking shop. But strangely, one of the little rooms where Duncan and I and von Neumann used to be was this one. I found it at the end of a hall. And the blackboard, though probably not the same, was the one where von Neumann used to teach us what we were doing and what we were about to do and what we were trying to do. And Duncan or I, or both of us, would sit in that corner. I'll swear those chairs are the same. The room hasn't changed at all since 1940. And that was the earlier wood building in which they conducted the first test. Today it's vehicle storage. And if you get up closer, you can see there's still some few pieces of lab equipment in there, mostly chemical. And there's a cat peering out one of the windows, if you can see it. Now, we need to focus a little bit. In 1933, an offer was made to von Neumann to join the staff by Abraham Flexner, who was then the director and remained director for many years. And that offer to join staff was at $10,000 a year, then an unheard of salary. Many people who joined the staff afterwards have become assistants to Dr. von Neumann, who joined at $1,500 to $2,000 a year, which was more usual. They wanted to make sure they got von Neumann. He already had a great reputation. And this one is, again, quite a bit out of focus. It's hard to get that one in focus. This is basically a letter written in reply to a query in 1942. What is von Neumann doing there on staff? And the then director wrote back, the bottom paragraph outlines it, that he is working in a secret government project which, if successful, will materially help to shorten the war. That was sort of an oblique reference to the Philadelphia experiment, as it was later known. But that project was afoot then and classified. I've talked with other people who were associates of von Neumann who knew of the project at the time, were not part of it, but nevertheless they were privy to the fact that it was there. Now, the place where the experiment took place. A little outline of Philadelphia. Let me get my pointer, if you can focus a little better. Courtesy of AAA. You'll find down here in the bend of the river, it's Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia Navy Yard is right in this location. And most of the testing, the final two tests and the third one, were conducted basically downriver. The river is about a mile wide at that point, and as you go further down towards the bay, it widens out appreciably. And in those days, it was rather deserted, without there being very much in the way of housing or civilization around it. This is the way the entrance to the Philadelphia Navy Yard looks today. These pictures were taken in the summer of '91. I will explain why I was able to take it so well. But it looks exactly the same, almost entirely the same as it was in 1940s when we were there. Same base, same entrance gate, same area, a separate road which came in over a long bridge. And this is the way the Navy Yard looked with an aerial photo in 1942-43. There's a big difference from that period to today. This was the forward section where all of the normal ship traffic, Navy traffic, came in. And the classified section was in back here, which was access was controlled by this bridge. And the building where we did the classified work after it became a classified project was this one right in here. It's an L-shaped building. And we sat on the top floor. We had views out over the harbor, this part of the harbor, where we could watch various ships come and go. And I still remember to this day a dress inspection we had by a friend of mine now deceased who was counterintelligence corps and a captain in the Navy, came in to give us an inspection. And I've not forgotten it. That is after I got the memories back. There was a lost memory among all the others for quite a period of time. All right, we should go. No, remote. Got it. This is what the Philadelphia Navy Yard looks like today. Somewhat more built up. That rail or piece of pipe you see in the front is the bridge across the river at that point on I-95. It did not exist in those days. As the older picture showed, there was nothing but open fields in back of the Navy Yard, and they had a great deal of security. They don't have much today, as you can see. You can stop on the bridge. There's a lane there and take all the pictures you want, including of the famous drawbridge, which controls access to the back section of the Navy Yard. You can see in the background some Navy ships in storage. They still do a lot of maintenance. There are rumblings that they may close the yard in '95. I do not know whether they really will or not, but they certainly don't have the security they once did. Another view showing a lot of ships still in there, many of them in storage. A shot at the famous Eldridge, E-173. Point out a few things on it. This is a file photo. This ship had 4 gun turrets. If you can get a little better focus, or is that the best you can get? I guess that is the best. Yeah. Number 1, number 2, 3, and 4. Notice that 1, 3, and 4 have tarps on them. Number 2 was open. Number 2 had a dummy wooden turret they could put on it whenever they left the Navy Yard. And the central mast structure was right here, on which the other antenna was mounted on top, the special one designed by T. Townsend Brown. The control room in which we were is this structure here. It was actually on deck level. That was the entrance door. And as you can see from this photo, there are, at that shot, at that time, some sailors standing there. But they wanted the equipment to be set up so that all of the cable lengths were equidistant, which said you had to have the generators essentially under this section, which was quite an accomplishment to get them from up here to there. That's why they had the rails in the interior. And they had 4 coils. 2 were port side, which was this side, 2 starboard over here. They were adjacent to each other, and they were set up in a pattern such that they were essentially around the antenna, and the antenna was actually central to the placement of those 4 coils. Now, there wasn't a square, obviously, it was oblong, but they wanted equal cable lengths because of the propagation delay, and they wanted the fields to be generated in a very precise and controlled manner. The fields actually were generated such that they rotated around the ship. I'll get into that later. But I wanted you to see what the Eldridge looked like, today called the Leon. And that basically is what the Eldridge looked like in that day. Now, in 1943, Tesla died, 7 January 43, and at the time I did my research at the archives at the Institute, they said they had no file on Tesla, but they pulled out this one piece of paper in a file entitled Tesla, which was a telegram announcing his death, the original. So I took a picture of it. It's hard to read, but it announced his death, sent on the 9th of January, and that there would be a funeral held on the 10th of January at St. John's in New York. They didn't hold the funeral for 2 weeks after that date because people came from all over the world to view the body. His reputation at that time was much stronger in Europe than in the U.S. So we did have an interesting funeral. T. Townsend Brown in younger days, when he was better looking. He died, to the best of my knowledge, in 1987. Oh, well, 1986, witnessed by a friend of mine. I spoke with him directly. And, of course, our own personal visits. Now, in 1955, after the Navy thought they had it all bedded down, and I was out of the circuit, and Duncan was out of the circuit, and they retired everybody who had been connected with the project. A little paperback book arrives in the in-basket of Admiral Firth's office, the Office of Naval Research, entitled The Case for the UFO by Morris K. Jessup. Nothing unusual about the book other than the footnotes hand-scribbled on virtually every page referring to conditions in space, the Philadelphia experiment, what went on and happened there with the disaster, etc. At that point, virtually no one in the Navy knew anything about it. The records were well buried. They set up a commission. The man on the extreme left seated, George Hoover, was in the Navy, and I've since spoken with him to verify all of this, as he's retired now. Various other people, you can recognize perhaps Dr. Werner von Braun seated on the right, and other various personnel, Navy and civilian, including Vero Corporation Board of Directors and people, because they were involved in the feasibility study of putting up satellites in 1955, and here comes a book telling about conditions in outer space, as if somebody had been there. That became very interesting. So did Morris Jessup. He was called to Washington 3 times. He says, I don't know anything about these notes, but he took his own copy, because he made up a special edition from Vero, the so-called Vero edition, of which there were 50 copies originally, and he did his own investigation. In 1959, he called a friend of his, the name of Dr. Valentine, living in Florida in Dade County, and says, I think I've got the answer. I'll be over to see you for lunch. So he headed over there. The public record says he never arrived, and his body was found the next morning in his car in the Dade County Park, dead of carbon monoxide poisoning from the usual hose from the exhaust in the window, that he, quote, committed suicide, unquote, and there was no briefcase or records in the vehicle. Of course, it hit the press for days, for weeks. The man became a martyr over this whole business because he was known to be investigating UFOs heavily and was on a hot project. Many people knew this, but they didn't know what it was. My research has indicated that he made it to Dr. Valentine's for lunch, discussed the business with Valentine with his notes, received a mysterious phone call warning that he was in extreme danger of his life and he should be very careful. So the good doctor, what happened to his notes, we don't know. We have no idea to this day where they went. Possibly Valentine knows. I've not been able to check with him. But our friend disappeared, got in his car, he disappeared, and I have had one report on the end of a talk show I was in by somebody who claims to have been an eyewitness to the fact that he was murdered and was able to escape by not being noticed and not really staying there. He said he saw von Neumann in the car. He didn't know who it was or whose car it was that afternoon in Dade County Park with 2 very tall, strange-looking people around him, and he seemed immobile in the car. The next morning, he was in the press, and he saw the vehicle on the license number, which he had noted, and he knew it was von Neumann's car, and von Neumann he saw that afternoon. He would not identify himself. Now, Jessup was the man who was dead, but the man who gave me the story would never identify himself as to who he was. And he said he considered himself lucky that he had escaped. Well, time went on, and the whole thing never completely buried after that. And after the project was over in 1983, von Neumann told the government he wasn't ever going to work for them again. So he went upstate New York with his wife, his second wife, actually his third, but by record 2. And she died, I believe, about 84. And he remained in this house till 85 when an electrical fire caused a considerable amount of internal damage. And he moved into a trailer, and this is what's left of the house. And he moved into a trailer. But around the house, in my visits, I took pictures of what was there, the chicken coops, the various buildings, all loaded with electronic equipment. And eventually, I did get to see him. And this was the trailer he lived in at that time, and that, of course, was my rental car, not his. For years, he did drive. He hardly does anymore now because his eyesight's failing. But he lives under a pseudonym. And this pseudonym was established apparently in 1977, if not earlier. But it became a problem in 77 because he started to suffer a split personality problem. And more, the split personality dominated him, but mostly after 1984. Howard Decker is the man who is known as the electronics man who sold tons and tons of electronic equipment from the end of World War II onward, and he still has lots of it up there. I won't say exactly where it is. And we visited him. I finally connected with him and talked for 3 hours the first time, all about his exploits in the electronics business, selling surplus. All of his information was correct because I've been over the same territory as he'd been in New York City. Finally, I asked him, almost in desperation, I says, Howard, do you know anything, or do you remember anything about the Philadelphia experiment? He says, no, never heard of it. I says, well, do you remember me? He looked at me and said, yes. He said, I don't know where from, though. They couldn't erase that memory. Later on, he did come out of it once, but it took a long time. This was a view, again, of one of his trips, Preston on the right. I was taking the pictures. The man known as Howard Decker with a cap on his head was kneeling down. Somebody came up to buy some electronics equipment from Virginia or somewheres, and there was a discussion. He went away without buying anything that day. Now, Van Neumann, as a younger man, take a good look at the eyebrows, the ears, particularly the left ear, the way it sticks out, the structure of the chin. And now, look at this man. Taken October 5th of 1991 when we took him to dinner. Notice the same protruding left ear, the same jaw structure, a sagging mouth, of course. A few years have intervened. The hair is gone. But so far as I am concerned, it's the same man. I'm sorry? Yeah, and it went completely by now, except for the sideburns. He lives in a very poor circumstance. Once or twice he has come out of it and remembered who he was. But so far as I know, the government has kept him in a state of, shall we say, suppression of the original personality and kept him in the Decker mode almost continuously since sometime in the late 80s. That's a good question. Why does he have to be kept alive? Well, they did try to kill him once. That's a long story. I can't go into all the details. But Preston got a report from his brother, and I was aware of it and called Preston first. He was shot and killed by the CIA upstate New York. And about a day later, Preston gets a call from his brother, who lives upstate New York, that Howard Decker was dead. The body was being shipped back home. The property is for sale. Would he, Preston, like to buy it? Would you like to make an offer? So Preston made an offer. It says, you'll be hearing from me. Preston never did. 2 months went by. And in that interim, suddenly Preston hears there's all kinds of activity on his property. And I sort of tune in on the situation, and I said, oh, yeah, he ain't dead. He's very much alive. We went up there and found him very much alive. They never did succeed in killing him permanently. He is kept alive by perhaps the same set of circumstances as availed for Duncan and myself. We went through a complete time loop. We're part of the Philadelphia Phoenix loop. Van Neumann has been through the whole thing himself. I didn't know that until later because he became involved in the problem of the 1963 node point and the potential backwash of the time waves which could have destroyed this continent. A special project was set up. Van Neumann was involved, as well as 3 other scientists whom I cannot name, not because I don't know who they are, but because of other reasons. And they stopped the whole thing from backwashing. They had to damp out the time wave. I'll explain that a little while later. But Van Neumann knew then very much what was going on. But now, today, he very seldom is himself. It's a very sad situation. Looking for relics of the Philadelphia experiment, at the time of my visit up there, I found this piece of equipment. It was a frequency meter, and anyone who's been on board the Eldridge through that period can recognize the vibes of an activated ship in a time project, and that piece of equipment had those vibes on it very strongly. And so I knew that one had come from the Eldridge. The nameplate on it, which is not too readily readable, dates from that era, 1941-42. It's built for our Bue ships. Another piece of equipment turned up. Strange history on this one. Preston still has it, I think. But in 1963, it turned up, according to the stories, in the yards of RCA Rocky Point, someplace out in the grassland. Nobody knows how it got there, but they picked it up, put it on the shelf. Years later, RCA Rocky Point facility was retired, closed down. And the engineers who had worked there were told, well, any of the surplus equipment that's left here, you're welcome to take home. We're going to have to scrap it, so take whatever you want. So one engineer brought home tons and tons and put it in his attic loft and in the basement and all that. The Tesla receivers, which Preston now has, came from that loft. I helped him unload them. The man died, and his widow 2 years later wanted to get rid of the equipment. Finally, she called Preston a little while later and says, "Hey, you forgot the basement." I says, "What do you mean?" I said, "The stuff down here. Come back and get it." This was in the basement. Preston takes it home to the lab and takes the lid off and looks at it, and one day Duncan comes in, sees this thing, backs up and says, "Get that blankety blank so-and-so piece of equipment out here. I can't stand it. It was on the Eldridge." So I got this by phone. I said, "Okay, save it for me, Preston. I want to see it." The next time I was in Long Island at one of the USPA meetings, he brought it over and I took the pictures. And I immediately identified it the same way. And this is what it looks like inside. Typical hard tube design from the 40s. We have no idea whether this thing would work now or not. Chances are it would, because most of the equipment then was built so ruggedly, a little bit of cleaning up, maybe a few components replaced, it'll still work. But Preston's not attempted to make it work. Let me back up one. This same piece of equipment is still being built and used by JPL. I have this from very confidential sources. And I am breaking a lot of confidences today for the simple reason that this morning Preston's life was threatened at gunpoint if he were to talk. And I was not. But we are letting it all out. Right here in the hotel. This piece of equipment, backing up one again, was the master pulse generator used aboard the Eldridge to generate the pulse trains which fed all the other equipment. There was another piece of equipment we don't have, and we don't have pictures of hardly any of the other equipment, but the pilot pulse generator. Okay. There was a zero-time reference generator, a lot of amplifiers, other associated frequency generators and such, all part of this equipment. We can easily blow out and draw a block diagram, and it has been done in part, but we're not going to do it now. Now, 1990, this gets into a very strange era for me. I went lecturing up in Pennsylvania in the first weekend of October in 1990. Preston went to Deerfield, New Hampshire, and was there at the swap meet. He found this piece of equipment. I think you found that later at Philadelphia that same weekend, didn't you? Yeah, okay. While up there, a man approaches him and says, "You're Preston Nichols, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes." He says, "I'm Jeff Cameron. I'm looking for Al Bielek." I knew I should have been there that weekend, but I had already committed myself to the lecture, and tells this very strange story to Preston. It says, about 2 weeks ago, I was back in Albuquerque where I live. I was grabbed by the feds, taken to an underground base, held there what I think was about a week. And one day one of them walked away and he left the other one there. I slugged him and ran. It says they shot at me, but I got out. And I had already planned to come here to meet with you because some 2 or so months prior, a videotape was given to me by a friend, which was the truth of the Philadelphia experiment, a 2-hour underground video which has been all over this planet to virtually every country on Earth. I can quote the countries almost. And he says, I finally found out what happened to my father. He said, I haven't known all this time, and I want to talk with Al. And he says, Preston says, well, he's not here, he's lecturing. He says, well, they talked for a while, put in a little bit of the background of the family that he remembered. He says, I'm going to Canada. And I said, I'll probably go to Australia from there. I can't stand what's happening to me. I've been harassed by the feds off and on for years. Well, 2 weeks prior, it was very curious because 2 weeks prior, I was in Albuquerque at the Albuquerque State Fair, the New Mexico State Fair, on the 20th of September. I had found Jeff's phone number in the phone book finally. It was a mobile phone. I tried to call him for 6 months. The phone never answered day or night. And I figured, well, he'll probably be there at the State Fair. So I arrived. As I walked in the gate to the State Fair, I saw one of the typical government gum shoes with the dark glasses, a little hat, and, of course, the two-way radio on his belt. I looked at him, he looked at me and sort of half sneered, and I looked back and half sneered and says, well, I know what you are, but I don't know why you're here. I knew my son was there someplace on the fairgrounds, and suddenly I felt a sense of panic, and he ran and left, and I'd never connected. I went back to my motel room that afternoon, called his phone number again, and it answered for the first time. Not Jeff, some young male voice. I asked for Jeff Cameron. Never heard of him. Slammed the receiver down. Called a second time. I want Jeff Cameron. Nobody here by that name. Slammed it down second time. I called a third time. I said, no, just a minute. This is Jeff Cameron's phone number. Who are you? Well, I never heard of Jeff Cameron. I don't know who he is or what you want. He says, I want Jeff Cameron. I said, this is his phone number. And this is his phone. Well, we don't know anybody by that name. And he hung it up again. Called the phone company. Gave him the number. Whose name is this phone currently registered in right now? He looked it up, came back in about 2 minutes, says in the name of Jeff Cameron. I said, right now currently? He said, yes. Never did connect with him again. Months later, I connected with somebody on the phone, says, never heard of Jeff Cameron. Well, what are you doing with this phone? Well, I've had it for years. I said, oh, really? I said, that's very interesting. The phone company says it's listed in the name of Jeff Cameron and has been in the phone book for quite some time. Who are you? Well, they gave some excuse and some answer, and I said, well, this phone is costing me money. I said, sorry about that, but I'm trying to find Jeff Cameron. Never heard of him. So he and I hung up. Within a week, that phone was disconnected, and within a month, no information was available about that phone number or who had it, even though I had investigations launched by private security people in Albuquerque, as well as connections with a phone company in Phoenix. They were not given access to that information, whereas previously in September I could get it over the phone. Nonetheless, he showed up at Deerfield and disappeared. I have reason to believe he's in Canada today, but I've never connected with him since. The government interferes every time. I will not tell you what I think about it. It's not polite. This receiver turned up in Philadelphia that same weekend where I was to meet Preston, and this strange older guy wandered up and talked with Preston, says, hey, where'd you get that receiver? He says, oh, I got it in a swap meet here. He says, well, I recognize it. That was aboard the Eldridge. I used to use it. What do you mean it was aboard the Eldridge? He says, I was a technician, and it comes out that he was a third technician assigned to Duncan and myself. The one that got zapped, he told about as being zapped by this third generator, which had been installed by von Neumann, that never worked, and that he recovered in the hospital and left the Navy and was never much involved with electronics after that. We talked for a period of time. I would love to have talked with the man. He suddenly got very red in the face, flushed, dropped on the spot. Preston called the medics. By the time the medics got there and checked him over, he was dead. Massive heart attack. We do not know whether it was an accidental or induced, but he was quite dead. One other receiver that was found on the, we knew was on the Eldridge, in the control room installed between test 1 and test 2. Right, it came out of the Philadelphia area from one of the swap meets. Preston found it. He bought 2 of them. This one had strange vibes on it, verified by both Duncan and myself. We refurbished it, put a few parts in from the other one to make it fully 100% original. We turned it on, it worked. It still works. And it's an excellent receiver. It's 50 years old. Look at the nameplate. Yes, it did. Federal Telegraph Company, the proper date and all of that. They've undoubtedly built many of these, but very well built. All tubes, of course, built like the proverbial battleship for Navy service. Yeah, we made a good boat anchor. It was heavy enough. Well, let's see. I do have one blank one in there. Let's get into my family. This is father, grandfather really, my father's father. Edward Cameron, picture taken about 1891 according to the legend on the bottom. And this was father, my father, at the age of about 10, taken about 1901. In the typical way they posed young kids for photos for the family album. Very formal, an old daguerreotype. And this is father taken in 1917. The legend on the bottom of the picture says 1917. In a Navy uniform, he was a bosun's mate first class, if you can see the 3 slash marks. It's the only picture we have of him from the Navy. We have no further evidence that he was in the Navy or out of the Navy, no records. And we know that he served until the end of 1929 because the town historian living in East Islip, I believe, whom I contacted, had a large file on the family, including lots of pictures. And he said, oh, he left the Navy in 1929. He had a heart condition. So they gave him a pension. He never worked a day in his life again, except projects he liked, like building sailing ships for the Long Island Regatta. This his father, taken in 1941 in his Coast Guard uniform. He was not formally in the Coast Guard. He volunteered services over 3,000 hours during World War II. It's a rather curious resemblance. He was in excellent health, a very good-looking man even at 50, and he was chasing women most of his life. I mean, he was a real, pardon the expression, rake. 6 wives. Number 1, number 2, and number 6 were not legal, but number 2 through 5 were, with the marriage certificate and all of that. When he died in 1981, his 6th wife inherited the house in Virginia, and Duncan inherited the beach house on Babylon on Captree Island. The citation for father's service in the Coast Guard, note that he ran under the name of Arnold at that time because he had adopted the name because he was raised by Auntie Arnold. He went back to the name Cameron, and it was never a legal change. I checked that. When I obtained the birth certificate, they told me if it had been legally changed, it would have been noted on that certificate. This is some of the boats he built, raced in the regatta, one like that. Go through this fairly fast. He loved to fish. This is Lake Saranac, about 1950, upstate New York. And another shot of him as a fisherman, aging. The photo not in very good shape. And an unidentified member of the family, I'm still trying to find out who it is, who's known to be a family member, but father was not on that trip. That's about all I can determine. And this picture was taken, we're not sure exactly when. Could have been taken in the 40s, could have been taken in the early 50s. Most likely in the 50s. He had other ships and interests, fishing fleets, shrimpers, and such, and deep-sea fishing was a main hobby. These were some of his awards. Father in the middle, the man on the left we don't know, the man on the right was the vice president of Morgan Guarantee and Trust Company. So father traveled in very interesting circles. This is the family seat in the East Islip. It is still there. West Islip, I'm sorry. And it is still there. It was built in 1906. And we were raised there. Auntie kept it under the family name until sometime around 1940 or a little later. It was a 23-room mansion. She fell off a horse, broke her leg, was nursed back to health by a Jesuit priest and some nurses. And she got religion, as the saying goes, and donated her fortune in the house to the Catholic Church. The church later sold the house off to private interests who continue to hold it. It's been cut up into 6 apartments, but they maintain it because it is a landmark so officially listed by the town of East Islip. Well, East Islip, West Islip, this plaque is in the hallway as to who it is listed by. I think it's just Islip. Right. Another view of this house, very extensive, huge grounds. Now, Duncan had approximately the age of 8. Notice the lighter colored hair, slightly reddish, approximately age of 10. This was the early Duncan with a surrogate soul before the age of 12. And this is Duncan at about age 16 in Florida, at the Florida house that father maintained at that time. Change in personality, the hair still reddish, very fun-loving, impish. This was the private school he graduated from, Marblewood in Connecticut. He was a 4th from the right. He somehow managed to get through. We only found out very recently that Marblewood is an NSA training school. Now it raises some very serious questions. What was he doing in an NSA training school, and how much does his mother really know? She sent him there, that's correct. After he graduated with father down in Florida, and now we know why father almost always wore a hat, almost totally bald. And that was before he enlisted in the Air Force, and his hair turned dark. He went in the Air Force in 1968, was there until about 72. He served in Vietnam. Long story I won't go into. Eventually wound up as part of the Montauk Project, and eventually I relocated him. Of course, the period around 1985 at the USPA. In 1981, Father died, and this picture was taken of Duncan in the period around 1981-82. He had a little money. He acquired the beach house, bought a catamaran, but if you look at him closely, there's a vast change in the personality, and I have other pictures of him I won't even show. They're so dark and show such a darkened personality that really the vibes are grossly negative. You don't want to see them. And that showed on him at that time. The project ended. He was debriefed. He met Preston early on in '84. And things changed then. And then, of course, I met him. And then this picture was taken of Duncan, who looks much like he is today in '86, doing carpentry work, his current trade, from about '84 on. And working on Preston's father's house. 1989 at a U.S., let's see, that was a local Long Island UFO chapter meeting. USPA? That was Psychotronics? I thought that was no, this was not taken in the store. This was taken at the meeting put on by John Ford. I remember now, that was... No, whatever. Yeah, the paneling was there, but it was like that at the other one, too. Anyway, 1989, that was Duncan. I don't know the next man. The one on next to the left, we know today is Frank Valenti. He's a friend of all of us. 1990, taken at the Whole Life Expo in New York, October, where Preston and Duncan were attempting to sell some electronics hardware. Very little change in his appearance during this period. Now, what happened to the rest of my family? It's a difficult story. I've never really connected with them. But nevertheless, in the early period of 1960, I bought property in New Mexico, subscribed to this magazine entitled New Mexico Review, and the August '65 issue arrived, turned over the page, and I see this picture advertising what happened the year before in '64 for the New Mexico State Fair, and saying, well, come to the State Fair this year, and similar activities. Cattle judging contest. The man second from the left immediately drew my attention, the one that's kneeling. Didn't know who he was, but I was almost agitated by the picture. I had to go to the New Mexico State Fair, which I did in '65, to try and see if he'd be there. He was not. I asked a lot of questions of the Fair Commission. They couldn't tell me who he was or wouldn't. And I said, well, who were the contestants? We can't tell you. Well, who won the contest? Well, we can tell you that, but we'll send you the list and mail it to me. I never did receive it. Well, who did the picture? Well, they told me who, and I went and got an 8x10 glossy and eventually blew it up. And this was a blow-up of that picture. This is the picture I showed to Preston just before he went to Deerfield, New Hampshire in October, the first October weekend in 1990. And, of course, that was taken in 1964. And I have reason to believe that was Jeff, because his life has been in agriculture. I found that out. And there was an accident that thing survived. Nobody knew who he was, and he was never identified. And many people since, many good psychics, have asked them, is there anybody in this picture, showing them, of course, the larger picture, that might have any connection with me? And they all point at the same individual. Made several attempts to meet with him. I never have. Preston says, yeah, look like the same guy, but much older. Well, 47 now, I guess he would. All right, let's hold this slide, and now let's get into the theory. I'm going to shut the slide projector off for a moment. We'll come back to this one. Just shut the light off. We'll leave the fan on. If you don't leave the fan on, it'll burn the bulb out. Put some lights on. Now, what were we attempting to do on the Eldridge? One of the first things we learned when we went to school in 1940 with von Neumann was that we're not living in a three-dimensional universe, we're living in a five-dimensional universe. The three physical dimensions that we know, plus the fourth dimension, which of course has been fairly well defined by everybody from P.D. Uspensky in 1931 and Tertium Organum to Einstein to others, as being time. But it's not as simple as that. About to say we have no chalk, but we do. Let's draw a little diagram. I would like to have these in my slides, but I haven't been able to get them made up in slides yet. Let's say that this represents the three dimensions of our reality as we know them. We'll just call them D1, D2, D3, all at right angles to each other. Everything in this room, etc., everything we know, solid three-dimensional structure. But there's an interesting point about this. These things have endurance in time. If there was no time flow, nothing would exist. They are dependent upon a higher dimensionality to exist, and that higher dimensionality is time. So we'll draw it as a dotted line with an arrow on it, indicating there is a flow, and we can call it, for convenience, T1. It is, in a certain sense, at right angles to the other three, but that is not a true relationship. It is a flow of time, and I'll get back to that in drawing up or slide to explain it further. But T1, or the fourth dimension, is not the only dimension that's involved. There's a secondary dimension called T2, or a spinner. And this thing is really a vector which rotates at right angles on T1. In other words, if I were to use this pointer to represent T1, or the fourth dimension, you have T2, a spinner, as a vector at right angles rotating around the end. But it's doing more than that. It is T2 that really is the control function, because this thing is traveling as a helix, if you want to draw it that way mathematically. And as it rotates in this manner, it is doing a corkscrew number through the universe, and that corkscrew number, the forward motion, the average time of this other vector, which I drew here, is time as we measure it. We do not measure the spinner. We only measure T1. And that T1, under all normal circumstances, is a constant. It can be altered. And that's what we were working on. What were we trying to do with the Philadelphia experiment? We were trying to change the position in the time stream of the ship sufficiently with electromagnetic means that the energy which would come from a radar signal or from light would pass straight through so far as anybody could tell or see. There would be no reflection. And if there's no reflection of any energy, light energy, radar energy, or whatever, you have no image. Everything you see or I see or a radar display screen sees is dependent upon reflected energy. If there's no reflection, you don't see anything, regardless of whether it's there or not. And that was the basis for producing the invisibility field. Now I'll go back briefly to the slide. If you want to turn the light back on, and the light's out, we'll cover this slide, then we'll go on from there. In a book entitled How You May Explore Higher Dimensions of Time and Space by P.D. Bielek is the man, published 1989. He has a number of different drawings, but this one, the so-called Torus of Time, is perhaps the best and the most explanatory. How You May Explore Higher Dimensions of Space and Time by T.B. Bielek. I have it there. In fact, it's sitting under the slide tray, I think, or under the slide projector. Now, as he shows it here, and it's mathematically quite correct, you have a torus formed by time, because time is not open-ended. It is a closed loop, so far as we can tell. And this is what Einstein said, among other things. He said there is no such thing as a straight line in our universe. If you think you have a straight line and you could send a straight line out, let's say from your chest, and you went long enough and far enough, you'd wind up hitting yourself in the back. Of course, this is speaking theoretically, and also it is correct in the sense that it is a curved, closed universe. And this also applies to time. But this corkscrew spinner generates the timeline, which we reference, but it also does something else. It generates the normal reality, which we know as we exist in. But there are alternate realities. If you go 90 degrees around this torus, you will have another reality, an alternate one, very similar to ours, Many things, most things would be the same. There might be a few people missing. There might be a few additional people. A building or two might be different. But it'll appear to be exactly the same as ours because it's locked in the same time stream, but it's phase shifted by 90 degrees. Now, if you take an object, such as a warship, if you were to take it 90 degrees, it would be in another universe, so to speak, another reality. If you take it part way around, like about 60 degrees, it becomes invisible, but it is still physically there. You can go up and hit it. So that was what basically we were doing at that time. Now, of course, invisibility has seen a few improvements and a few changes. That was the basic business, and you can have a number of alternate realities. You can also have split-offs from the main line to still other realities, and you can even go into other universes. This gets into deep theory I don't want to get into. And for that matter, I don't even know most of it. It's very involved and very abstruse. But I thought you'd like to see this because this represents quite well what Einstein said in his unified field theory. It's a closed universe and a closed circuit. Preston on Friday gave more information in terms of the time sea and how the time function actually works. Yes. So let's have the lights back on and the slide projector off, and then we'll go on from there. We still have quite a bit to cover. Now, let's give a little plan drawing of the Eldridge. I'm not the world's greatest artist, like Preston. I guess I know. Neither of us are. Let's draw this sort of like this. That will represent the bow, and this will represent the stern of the Eldridge. Here, someplace in the middle, we had this antenna, we had this square room. We'll leave a lot off. We have gun turrets and so forth. We have this big antenna right here in the middle. But we have 4 coils designed by Tesla and used also by von Neumann with very little change other than he put a damping coil on the top, because when you go from a CW type analog signal to a pulse signal, these coils would ring like a banshee. 2 in front, 2 in back. These are gun turrets, so I'll just erase them. They may be confusing to you. The antenna in the center was a quadriphase antenna, which meant it had 4 phased sections to the array, each independently fed by a radio transmitter. Each transmitter was modulated by its own chain of electronics, which went back to the basic pulse generator, the zero-time reference generator, and so forth. That RF system was locked to, in terms of phase and frequency modulation generation to the pulse generator, to the magnetic system, but was independent otherwise. The magnetic system consisted of 2 huge generators, 2 75 kVA generators, electronically locked to each other. For reasons which I don't recall now, each had 5 field windings. There were 10 total. Each field winding was driven by a bank of 300 6L6 tubes, so there were 3,000 total. There were buffer drivers for those and so forth. They had to be able to modulate, turn on and turn off the current in the 5 windings, and they did it in a manner such that by pulsing it, they could still create a rotating magnetic field. You would phase these things. There would be, the 4 would be out of phase with each other, the same as here. In other words, you had a relationship basically of 90 degrees between each one for the RF and between the magnetic. They overlapped, but they did it even in spite of the fact they were pulsed. Correct, and that's a good point. They were conical. I was just about to describe that. Each coil stood approximately this high. They were narrow at the top, approximately like so. They tapered in a conical form down to the base, and tapering down to the base conically like that, they broadened out extensively, probably to about 3 feet. They had 2 cable feeds. There was not a Tesla coil in the sense of having a drive at one end only. They had actual solid cable feeds from the generators, and each coil was fed in its own separate amplifier chain actually from the generator, because they controlled the output of each coil from two separate sets of slip rings from the alternators, and the entire field windings controlled the phasing of the entire system because of the drive from the electronics. It's very complex, but they did get what they wanted in terms of the magnetics, so that they phased in correctly, and you wound up generating a magnetic field around this ship, which became, in essence, a toroid, an open toroid. Now I'll do another drawing for you. The RF fields were generated here within the magnetic field, and the two interacted. One was twice the frequency of the other. They were both tied to the famous pi/2 series, which is very basic to such phenomena on Earth. And they were keyed to each other, and they were keyed to other mathematics, which will give you a window. Now, how do we get it? Perhaps many of you don't know, maybe most of you don't know, there's a very strange relationship existing, as was pointed out in the unified field theory, between the E field or electrostatic field, a G field or the gravitic or tachyon field, whatever you want to call it, and the H field or magnetic field. I drew them this way because you can draw them in a different form. This, if you separate out and draw it in a slightly larger scale, with the arrows pointing in, would be again your E, G, and H. The forces will be forcing towards the center. Three interact, and of course they interact with time. And what happens is, if you manipulate E and H correctly, you also manipulate G, and if you manipulate the three of them, you then create a time effect. You change the local time. Now, by changing the local time, what do? You're changing the T2 spinner. So within the confines of the field, not outside of it, but within the confines of that field, you are actually changing the time flow rate, slightly. That was the intent. And by changing it slightly, the ship, in terms of the torus of time, goes from its point, normal point here, we'll call it normal, to someplace up here, if you're looking at the edgewise onto the torus, to someplace up here for the ship, somewhere's around 60 degrees. And then what you had to do was maintain the fields in another manner so they would lock at that point and not slip out of our universe, and maintain the invisibility. I'm sorry? Well, if you go too far around, the ship's out of our reality in another. How do they lock it there? By changing again the rate in which the T2 spinner rate internal to the field is reduced down to what it had been in the first place, i.e. you lock at that point. If you're not continually increasing the frequency, you don't maintain it at an increased frequency, you're just deriving a phase shift. When you get to the point you want, you restore the normal spinner rate in that local field. Right. That's all done through basically the generators, the main field coils of the generators. It's a very complex system. Of course, it took an enormous amount of power, and they generated very powerful fields, and the personnel, of course, were very badly hit by it. Those down below deck were not. They were shielded by the steel, with the exception of two men who developed a strange intermittent, one not so intermittent problem of invisibility. But those on deck went insane or disappeared totally. And I got a little more data on that, too. Okay, that was basically what they were doing. What did the shape of the field look like? This was the big problem. When the initial research was started, theoretical paperwork, they had a choice. They could either develop an open-ended type toroidal field, which took four simultaneous nonlinear equations, and that structure, looking at it on end, let's say from above, would show a field somewhat like this, much like a donut. And you would have an area in here where the ship was. And, of course, if you look at it sideways, you would see first the water. You would see a coil, not a coil structure, but a field structure, which would look somewhat like a donut. And you would have radiating out from here, of course, other aspects of the field, because the field was fairly well defined in here. And like any toroidal field, there's some leakage, particularly the way they ran this one. And you would have some part of the field structure above water and some part of the field structure below water. But here's the key point. The magnetic field coils were arranged in such manner, again, I'll draw them like this. You had a cable connection here and a cable connection here. These were on the deck, so they were pointing up. You would have all one field up one end and the other field down the other end. They would maintain the fields, and this is what you could do with pulsing it, maintain the field the way you want it. And you wound up with a magnetic field in here, the H field, which was all one polarity above water and the other polarity was below water. That's how they just got a monopolar magnetic field around the ship above water. Below water it was damped out, so it didn't really count that much, except right around the ship, wherein, of course, the water also became invisible. The water didn't go away. It was there. They formed an actual, even though it was a dipolar field, a monopolar field in terms of above water in the ship. And that was part of Tesla's earlier research. There are papers on this, I understand, available now, but I've not had time to go dig them out. So they had the choice between the open-ended field, the toroid, or if they wanted to go to it, and they chose not to because it was much more complex, would have been an oblate spheroid type field, which was closed. It didn't have a hole in the center. It was completely closed. The ship would have been enclosed in that field, and there would have been no possibility of something coming in from the outside and interacting with it. And of course, with this type of an open field, something could interact, and it did. There you had an open-ended toroidal field. The ship was in the middle. The critical date was 12 August 1983, as we found out much later, because on 12 August 1943, 12 August is the critical date, 43, 63, 83, we found this out years later, the Earth has its own biorhythms, like the human body, but there's 4 of them, and they all peak out every 20 years with a nice, sharp, synchronizing peak, 1 day wide, roughly. And that day is the 12th of August. You have to also take into account the slippage of the calendar due to the fact it's a Gregorian calendar, which will say that by the end of the century they have to add another day, so it's already slipped most of a day. So 12 August plus or minus half a day, possibly 1 day. But with that field structure, it was open. It was open to interference. It was open to coupling. So what happened? We'll do a little graph type thing. Here is the Eldridge in graphical form. 1943, 12 August. We'll draw this timeline as a dotted line. Up here we have 1983. We'll show a radar tower with a nice big radar antenna on the top. And this is 1983. And you also have a date in the middle, 1963, 12 August. Here we have the fields around this ship, an open-ended toroid. Here we have this generator out here, which is probably was much more powerful actually than the one down there, generating its own fields, but they were not generated by the radar antenna at that time. They were generated by a set of coils underground, a delta T function coil. On that date, the 12th of August, because on 22 July, this ship was tested and there was no lockup with anything. And we don't know now, unless Preston knows from his logbooks, whether or not the transmitter was on that date, but even if it was on, that is Montauk transmitter, was on the 22nd, there would not have been a lockup. The tube turned on that date. You got a coupling. what happens? Strangely enough, this little ship, not very little either, at 1,540 tons, takes off into hyperspace. An artificial structure in many respects, mathematically quite well defined, but in terms of the reality of the universe, it was out of our universe. The Eldridge was literally sucked into hyperspace because of the interaction of the two fields. That thing was very well anchored with a few million tons of earth, soil, concrete, and rock. And this thing was only 1,540 tons, so off it went. It wound up here. It was protected by its own fields from disintegrating, and as long as those fields remained intact, that ship remained intact and the person on board remained intact. Now, we couldn't control it. The thing went out of hand. We left the control room. We went outside. We jumped overboard. The ship was someplace up here in hyperspace, undefined time. You can't define time with this hyperspace function. So we jumped overboard, the two of us, and somehow we wound up back here at 83. There were two other people who jumped overboard, and they disintegrated. It was more than luck. It was, one could say, divinely controlled, one could say fate, or one could also add the factor that Duncan and I were already there, and the fact that I, as Al Bielek, was working on the Montauk project from sometime in 53 off and on until 83, and Duncan was there as Duncan number 2 on the project. He was physically there at the site on 12 August 83. I was not physically there on the site at 12 August 83. They told me to take a hike for a couple of days before that date. And Duncan was held elsewhere. But we successfully arrived for whatever reason. Then we were returned to the Eldridge back here. We went on board the ship, took access, smashed the equipment. The Eldridge winds up back here in 43 in the harbor about 4 hours later. They sent us back by means of the time tunnels and the time tunnel operation at Montauk because they had total control over space and time. Speaking in terms of mathematics, we stepped into a hole in the wall, illuminated, which is about 8 feet in diameter, in which we were propelled down that tunnel, if you will, and wound up in the decks of the Eldridge. We didn't fly, obviously, and that ship was in hyperspace, and somehow they knew how to connect with it. Don't ask me how, I have no idea. Now, Van Neumann might be able to tell, but he's not talking very much these days. The first one was quite terrifying. The second one, we knew what was coming, so it didn't bother us. The only thing was, in going back again, we were falling through what appeared to be a tunnel, or seemed like a tunnel, felt very strange. Very much like if you were to jump off the top floor of an elevator shaft when there's no elevator, and you go down. Of course, you don't hit the floor the way we did it, but that falling sensation, or if you jump out of an airplane with a parachute, that falling sensation you have until the parachute opens or something intercepts your fall. It's the weightlessness, it's about the same. That's a good question. There was air on board the ship. What happened when we left, we don't know. It wasn't that long. You can survive without oxygen for over 2 minutes. It took less. I'd say 1 to 2 minutes. If it was 1 minute, there would be no problem, even for somebody who was not used to holding their breath. I can't explain that physiological aspect directly, because I don't know exactly what happened that way. But 2003, you will have another potential lockup point. Well, I don't think the Eldridge is around with the equipment to do it, but this is still around, and it's operational again. They put it back online in August of 92. January 17th, 93, they had an explosion that put it offline, and then on June 17th, it blew up again. It's currently offline, but we know they're going to put it back online. They're working desperately to get it back online because on the 12th of August of 93, you have an in-between 10-year window point. Now, let me show you just a wee bit more. Then we're going to get into the time business a little more. Okay, let's draw this as a 20-year period, 43, 63. You have a semi-node point at 53, which is 10 years in between. Or if you call this 83, or rather we'll call that 2003, and call this 83. You have an in-between 10-year point, which in this case would be 93, that's this year, will be on the 12th of August. You have a 5-year semi-node point in which not much occurs, but the in-between one is active, and you can interact. We suspect, we think, we don't know, but we suspect that they want to extend that time tunnel from the year 1983 to 2003 because there is a solid wall in the year 2013 which prevents them from looking beyond it with a time machine, prevents them from doing much of anything. It's to keep this era from interfering with future era beyond the wall of 2013. I could talk a lot more about that, but it would take much time and revealing certain confidences. But in any case, we know they probably want to extend the wall because they have complained, not to me, but to Preston, they can't view beyond the year roughly 2013 with a time machine. They don't know what's going to happen beyond that. And these world powers, the New World Order people, they're worried. Are we going to be able to extend our power? Are we going to keep operating and controlling everything beyond 2013? They're literally worried. All I can say is tough. Okay, that is really what's going on now with the 93 thing. You have this 10-year in between node point, and that occurs every 10-year point between any of the other dates. Now, let's get into something more on this time business. The manipulation of time and that sort of thing. And at this point, very quickly, I'm going to get Preston in on it. There was a breakthrough, many breakthroughs. One other item I should tell you is when they resurrected the project for the Philadelphia experiment in 47, I'm sorry. And von Neumann was asked to reopen it to see if he could find out what really went wrong, what could be salvaged, if anything. So he reopened it, became involved, as he was then, in many projects, but basically he found that there was a problem that could be surmounted. The basic problem was the human element, not the hardware, in terms of the ship. How do you lock the time references of each individual down, which is established at the time of conception for each individual is born into this time frame, or any time frame, when the body is actually created as a functioning fetus? It has a time lock, and the soul that's going to go into that body has a lock on that point in time so that it will be referencing a specific point in history and not floating all over the place. And it goes through the point of process of being born. You live out your life. You know all your friends from every day. You don't slip out of the time stream and go somewhere else. But if you lose those time locks for any reason, and that is what happened to a lot of them on the Eldridge, because of the excessively powerful electromagnetic fields that wrecked their time locks, they started to float in space-time, literally, physically, as well as mentally. But they would float in that time reference, and while they were contained, as long as the fields were intact, when the equipment was destroyed and the Eldridge came back to 43, the fields were collapsing, the control over those individuals was lost, they drifted, some of them wound up in the bulkhead, some disappeared, and others were pulled for another project. We have some follow-on projects. Of course, von Neumann solved the problem. In 1953, they had a totally successful test. It was then reclassified again and called Project Phoenix. Project Phoenix is a coverall for an awful lot of projects. VIR, virtual interpretive reality, for other research projects on mind control, for a number of others. We don't even know all of the projects they did at Montauk. Weather control was part of it, Mount of Phoenix. That started at Brookhaven. Many, many projects. But when they finally solved this, of course, it went through many generations. They finally got the equipment small enough to put on aircraft. Today, it's on all the Navy fighters, all the Israeli fighters. the B-1 bomber, the B-2 bomber, the SR-71, all the large supercarriers. We don't know what else they can put it on, except we know it's down now to a nice little small package that you can put on your belt, flip a switch, and you're invisible. And the Secret Service uses it, and I have photos to prove it. I wouldn't be surprised what was in here in the last 2 days. But this is part of the ongoing research on invisibility, time shifting, time manipulation, time machines. But certain other things occurred in the 50s and the 60s, development of transistors, solid-state devices. And one of the very interesting little devices that was developed was a special germanium transistor known as the SBT, surface barrier transistor. This one was developed along several parallel pathways. There are at least 5 papers in the journals of the IEEE describing the Philco and Sprague process for producing these things roughly from about late 1950, I think 58, 59 on. There's a whole series of these papers showing the processing techniques. These were germanium devices before they came into production on silicon. Silicon, a whole new ball game, really. But they have very strange characteristics. And we have found, by accident, by design, whatever, that transistor working in conjunction with another device and a coil can very simply produce a time-modulating field. Now I'm going to draw you a block diagram and then a very rough, crude diagram of the electronics, because it is a very simple device and it's very portable. We'll start with what is basically an oscillator. We then have the transistor, and this one goes to, I think the way it's done right now is a -9 volts. This comes out to a coil, it then goes to ground, and of course you have an RC out here to control the frequency. It is one of these special surface barrier transistors, specially developed by the government on a special program in which was literally 100% of the product went to the government. And they shut the lines down in 1971 and were told the manufacturer to scrap over 500,000 of these things who didn't scrap them. They got buried. Yeah, this coil is a special 4-pi coil, which we can explain. But what happens when you turn this thing on and when you set a frequency, which is really the oscillating frequency of this 555 square wave output, without just simplifying this, you switch this device on and off. And because of the way this device works, in conjunction with driving some current through this coil, out of the end of this coil, you produce a delta T field. It is actually time modulating field. Now, Preston, do you want to get into the theory of this thing? Then we will demonstrate it. And I said, demonstrate it. That is a little hard to explain. I can't answer that one, really. It remained in hyperspace, and as I remember, some of the other data which has come through since indicates there was more than Eldridge in the hyperspace. There was other hardware seen floating around out there, like some aircraft, a submarine or two, and so forth, which, because of the fact, I did forget to mention, the Germans were working on the same project themselves in World War II. They lost a number of submarines totally through this project, their own version. And we also had 3, not 1 destroyer. We had DE-013, DE-078, and DE-173, which is the Eldridge. I don't know much about the other 2, except they were outfitted in the Philadelphia Navy Yard. I know 2 people who have verified this. And one of them sank in the Azores in this test, and what happened to the 3rd one, I don't know. But why none of them wound up at Montauk? It's a good point. I don't know. Justin, you want to take over?
Okay, before we go into the actual workings of the transistor, let's first go deeper and heavier into the delta T function. What is delta T? Delta, of course, is change. T, of course, is time. Change is modulation. Now, how do we get delta T? This can be yielded from essentially a transform, which is a function of frequency going to a function of time. How do we get this? I have to erase the beginning of the antenna here. Let's consider what really this is all about. If we have, let's call this our delta function here. This is yielded from essentially a summation, n equals 0, n equals infinity. This is essentially functions of frequency coupled with time sub 0 crossed by time sub infinity. This, of course, will give you almost an infinite series. It will just keep going on and on and on and on. This series turns out to be holographic. So we could essentially limit this by a bandwidth. What we're doing here is we're taking a frequency transform, crossing it, processing it by a cross of t sub 0, cross of t sub infinity. What is t sub 0? This, of course, is the center of the torus. T sub infinity is the edge of torus. If you remember from my lecture on Friday night, I drew the time torus, the whole time enchilada. I really don't want to go through this because this will take a lot of time to explain once again. So what do we actually end up here with? We'll end up with essentially multiple integrals, 0 to t sub 0, 0 to t sub infinity. This is now a delta t. This is now the function inside here is essentially our frequency transform times t sub 0 cross t sub infinity. Now, we got to put a constant out here. If we don't put a constant out here, this whole thing falls apart. This is going to be another cross with gravitation. Okay. Now, what we're getting at here, have to excuse me, I'm recalling this all from memory. I did not expect to do this, so I didn't bring a stack of notes like that to try to reduce to something simple. We again have to put this, which is essentially, now we also have to put in delta t, doing backwards. D sub t, d sub 0, d sub infinity, and d sub frequency. And we have to also put in here a third integral, which is minus f to plus f, which represents the bandwidth. Remember, we're talking here infinite bandwidth. This is holographic. You can take a limited slice of this bandwidth and you'll still get the delta t function.
The t0 and t infinity are
No, no. T0, again, is the center of the time torus. We're on a manifold that goes from the edge to the edge of the time torus. As those spinners, as the twisters rotate in the time torus itself is a closed-end spinner. As those twisters twist, they create tangents, which create manifolds in the edge, in the center, where they all cross multiple manifolds, that T sub 0. Now, the outer edge of the torus is T sub infinity. Yeah, this is all vectors here. We're doing essentially a scalar vector cross product. Because, no, yeah, okay, yes.
On this integral equation here, can there be another integral for the gravity?
Yeah, right here. G is an overall integral. That essentially is del cross E cross B I'm not sure if I'm putting this down exactly correct. This is a triple del cross product G. Now you got to put here all this crud for J, omega, epsilon, mu, and the gravitational constant, which is usually little g. You got to add that all on at the end of this. This is equal to what, people? 0, real, and plus or minus I, J, K. I is T sub 0, J is T sub infinity, K is your gravitational constant again. What is this telling us? We have to sum these all things together. We can pick this out. All this drops out. And we get essentially that electric vector crossed to a magnetic vector is through a curl, or the del function, and you curl again to get to the gravitational vector. You got to take this, substitute this up there. This thing keeps growing bigger and bigger. Now, this F sub T, what is this? This is a frequency transform. Now I have to erase the blackboard. Everybody got it before I erase the blackboard. Because I've run out of space. Here? This is the initial summation of your frequency, time 0, time infinity, where you're going from the 0 harmonic to the infinite harmonic. This is everything. This is the whole universe. Well, of course, we're limiting the bandwidth. So now we're breaking it up into integrals, where we go from a minus f to a plus f, which is giving us the bandwidth factor, because our systems are not infinite bandwidth. At least not yet. Here, let me put this back. Maybe what we should do is bring the blackboard up here. Okay, hang on. Everybody got this?
You mean have a cross on
Not cheap, but electrogravitation is very important in this.
If you don't have a cross indicated there. Yeah. That's lower equation.
Right here.
No, that's the lower one down. The curl equation.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry about that.
What is the O on that top sigma formula, the OF for S of F?
This is a mathematical function. Okay, can I go now continue?
Yep.
We now going to go into a little bit of theory on delta pulses. I'll repeat that. I'll repeat it. I only have two hands. Okay, now we got to go into some theory on Dirac delta pulses. What is a delta pulse? You have amplitude in this direction, whether it's voltage, current, whatever, it doesn't matter. You got time this way. You go along, all of a sudden, you got a spike. It goes up, comes down on the same spike. Let's now expand this. It comes out a nice square rectangular pulse. The true Dirac delta pulse, in theory, is pulse width. It's the limit of the delta P is delta pulse. It's the limit of the frequency transform as pulse width goes to 0. If you're taking this thing and you're shrinking it to 0, what happens, engineers in the audience, when you shrink this pulse width to 0? The bandwidth of the pulse goes to infinity. It starts at the rep rate of the pulse that goes to infinity. Now, consider this. What's the tan? What's the tangent of 0? 0. What's the tangent of 90 degrees? Infinity. So what is this telling us? In the ortho-rotation world that your tangent represents, because the tangent goes like this, 90-degree rotation is you're going from 0 to infinity. So that means, what this means, if we take our limited bandwidth and generate 2 or more 90-degree functions, we can now take that limited bandwidth and make the pulse appear to be a true Dirac delta pulse. This is how the delta T antenna works. Delta T antenna, to review, of course, is a triple delta loop. It ends up being the double pyramid shape. X, Y, and Z. What is this thing? A loop this way. A loop this way. A loop this way. We got 3 delta loops, orthogonal, right angles to each other. Now, if you remember, we had our multiple cross products involving electrogravitation, T sub 0, T sub infinity,
and our infinite frequency transform with the frequency coefficients from n equals 0 to n equals infinity. We can't do that. We got to go from n equals 0, that's your DC component, to some finite boundary, maybe 20 kilohertz. So now we're going to have an integral equation. 0 here, 20 kc here. Take it every hertz, so it means you got 20,000 steps in your integral for your limits of integration. This is 0 to t sub 0. This is 0 to t sub infinity. Now we're going to put in here our delta of n. This would be n. We're going to put in our frequency, our transform of frequency. We're going to put in our t sub 0, which actually is the tangent of 0. We're going to put in our t sub infinity, which is actually here, tangent of infinity. Yeah. So this has to be tangent of 90. I'm no better than any of your other college instructors. We all make mistakes. I'm not alien, no more than anyone else in this room is alien. Now also, I don't know what the correlating equality is, but we have, I'm going to show it this way, G, your G vector. What I'm saying here is we don't understand the proportionality, but we don't need it to bend time. Now, considering that this is tangent of 0, as long as we have some function that is referenced to tangent of 0, or t sub 0, we can satisfy this. Tangent of infinity, t sub infinity. How do we get t sub infinity? This is something I have grappled with for years. Last night, while trying to sleep in this hellhole, I finally remembered how it was done. Anyone know what white noise is? White noise is a frequency transform with all frequencies in it. It's a group of Dirac delta pulses of different rep rates superimposed to make this broadband. So now, to make this broadband function, we call white noise. White noise is 50% correlated to anything and everything. Our reality is 50% correlated to the entire white noise function. Our reality, if you look at it as the whole enchilada, what do we come out with? It's fractals, right? Fractals. Now, if you take fractals over the entire limit, 0 to infinity, what do you come up with, people? A broadband noise-like function. So any Gaussian type white noise source which is magnetically focused, since remember the last lecture I gave, we spoke of the magnetic field as being potential field 90 degrees away from us. You have to have a special white noise source which is magnetically focused. Is a T sub infinity reference. So now this is Tesla's whirligig, as I call it. This is white noise. What is Tesla's whirligig? This is what we call our zero-time generator. If you remember, any of us familiar with the history of Nikola Tesla, he worked with all sorts of resonance, or another friend of mine says resonance. What he discovered is if you get two inertial rotating masses, inertially rotating, if you can relate the mass of the two objects, where the mass times the rotation of one is an integer relation to the mass times the rotation of the other, they're going to sync together through gravity. So what he built was a motor generator where the speed of the motor times the inertia of all the rotors in the motor generator was inertially matched to the rotation of the Earth. This was developed for the FAA in the 20s because back in the early 20s, the FAA was developing landing systems. They had to have a reference that was constant all over the Earth. They didn't have good crystals in those days. LC oscillators drifted like an SOB as we still have today. So he decided to make this weird motor generator locked up onto the rotation of the Earth. Figuring the Earth is rotating the same everywhere, you'll have the same frequency everywhere. I have a number of these devices. Al has one in his possession also. They were built for the FAA in the 60s and the 50s. You turn the thing on, you hear the thing speed up, it whirls its way up, and then you hear it lock in. It doesn't lock into the power line. Why? It's a synchronous motor that they drive it with. 1800 RPM, which is a 4-pole motor on 60 hertz, or 30 hertz rotation. Now, I've taken that reference generator and operated that thing from 58 to 62 hertz. Its output frequency did not change once it locked in. Now, when you went below 58 hertz, 57 something, it dropped out of lock, and then the motor tracked the frequency, and when you went above 62 something to 63, same thing happened. So this generator is locking in to something besides the power line frequency, or else you wouldn't have that window where it doesn't change its frequency, the output frequency. Now, this locks to the rotation of the Earth. The Earth is now inertially locked to the rotation around the Sun. The orbit of the Earth is inertially locked through the inertia of the Sun and the Earth to the rotation of the Sun. The rotation of the Sun is inertially locked to the rotation of our galaxy, around the center of our galaxy. The center of our galaxy is inertially locked to the rotation of our reality. Now, people, what is the center of our reality inertially rotated, inertially locked to? Yeah, 0 time. So this Tesla whirligig is a 0 time reference. We have our white noise, which is a T sub infinity, an infinity time reference. Now, what do we do with gravity here? What do we get if we do a cross product of these? Does anyone know? I know, it's difficult. Yes. Now, what is cross? A nonlinear function, a mixer. If we had about 16 hours, I could explain the math behind it.
You're just talking about
Two tangent functions, 0 and infinity, 90 degrees. Gravity is the crossing of no activity with all activity. You create a rotating vortex wind between the 2 points. Remember, we just said that 0 time is T sub 0. Time infinity is a tangent of 90, tangent of 0. We got the tangent of 0 here. We got the tangent of 90 here in the white noise. Now we got to take this one off. Well, I'm going to leave the antenna in delta T. Now I'm going to show you how to make this device. Although this is a lot bigger than the device we've made. We'll get into how we make that device later. I'm telling you at this point, I'm showing you the secret of time. Time modulation. Okay, let's put over here our zero time reference. This has two outputs, 30 hertz, fixed, and 30 hertz, phase variable. If you look at the Tesla zero time reference, it's got a big knob on the front and a dial behind the window that says 0 to 360 degrees. There's two 30 hertz alternators. One is rotated by this knob and dial. So you can gain precise control by rotating the two generators to each other, which relates to the Eldridge owl, because they're now changing the rotation by changing the fields. In this case, they rotate the entire field mechanically. So it's got two outputs, 30 hertz, reference phase, and variable phase. We take these two outputs, we put it into mixers. Now, we take our white noise generator, our general radio. I think it's an 1863, if I recall, which is a little box about that big that has a Gaussian noise tube in it and two 6AQ5 amplifiers with its levels and a level control meter for its output. Has bandwidth limitations. This thing can go to 500 kilohertz bandwidth or 20 kilohertz, or I think it's 5 megahertz also. If I remember, it's an 1863. Get the old GR catalog and look up their Gaussian noise source. This thing, General Radio, this thing is available on the surplus market, a dime a dozen. General Radio must have made trillions of these things. You modulate with the white noise output. Well, also you have another tap. Now, what do we do next? The function you're going to put into the delta time has to be a quadrature function. Another mixer. Two mixers. This is going to be f sub x, and this is going to be f sub y. This is the dual output from the Montauk chair system. They're a quadrature, two outputs are right angles to each other. Then we go here, the two amplifiers. This one becomes the Y amplifier for the Y loop. This one becomes the X amplifier for the X loop, here and here. So what are we doing here? We are taking our cross-product function that you're using to generate the frequency transform you want to broadcast, putting it in here, driving it to two sets of coils, X and Y. This is going to create your twister, a rotating, very small donut where the diameter of the donut essentially is 0. If your bandwidth is infinity, but it becomes 1 over the bandwidth. Now, what do we do with Z? It's very simple. Another amplifier to Z. This takes our twister and makes it into a spinner around the antenna. Now, by crossing the two functions, you can now remember, I was talking of taking delta functions of a particular bandwidth. Because you're crossing the two delta functions with 90-degree loops, this will be like multiplying the two tangents together. And this will give us, operation-wise, an infinite bandwidth outside the antenna. You'll get an infinite bandwidth. What are we generating here? a vortex. Because of the fact that this rotating vortex is buildup of a frequency transform function, which by the activity of the right angles of the antenna, 3 right angles now, it's all going to appear to be noise, because we're modulating our signal with a noise gated by the 30 hertz. They are coming from a computer, a mind amplifier. This is your function that you're broadcasting into the time domain. I'm telling you, specify it's got to be 2 functions in quadrature to each other. It's got to be biphase quadrature, which, to our medical people in the audience, what organ in our body works on biphase quadrature? The brain. Somebody, who was the bright man that said the brain? Stand up, sir. A round of applause. We got somebody that's awake in the audience. I've just shown you now. You can fine-tune the phase relationship from the zero-time reference. What you'll find as you tune through, you'll be able to actually fine-tune how far in time relationship this will vary. If you match the 90 degrees here to the 90 degrees here, if the fidelity of all the information channels is infinite, what do we have? We have a controlled time portal in the center of this antenna. Now, we've left one piece out. How do we construct our delta loop? Let's take one loop. Do you have any old radio men in the audience? What's the next thing we do with this, sir? You shield it, right? We're making a magnetic probe here. So you put a shield around this thing. What do we now got? A radio direction finding delta loop. But what's going on here? We're taking E cross B and stripping the E off it. What do we have, folks? We have a function which is already ortho-rotated 90 degrees out of our reality. Now, how do we control this? We put right down the center of this thing an antenna, a rod. At the same time, we have our ground function. We connect the rod and the ground to a switch, a commutating switch. We're going to make this dotted. We drive the switch from the rotation of the zero-time generator. It's got to be integer related to the rotation of the wheels in the zero-time generator. What do we hook here? We hook our radio transmitter. Now, this is a very unique radio transmitter. It's ISB. Any of the hands know what that means? Independent sideband. This is a double sideband suppressed carrier transmitter. But lower sideband is at 0 degrees. Let's put it over here. Is at 0 degrees. Carrier equals 90 degrees. Upper sideband, upper is 180. This is called a bi-quad, bi-phase radio transmitter. We put in to the upper sideband f of y. We put into the lower sideband f of x. Now, at the same time, we take this transmitter and somewhere in the amplifier chain, we put a gate or a mixer, and we put our white noise. We take the output of the transmitter, put it into this RF switch. How many people have seen the electrogravitational generator, which is a torus coil with another coil inside of it, where they put a high voltage potential between it? This is what we have here. We put this between ground and our RF signal back and forth. From the Eldridge, the 4 coils created the delta T magnetics. The RF transmitter created the electric field component of this. Now, when you do del cross B, del cross E, del cross G, sum it all to 0, it equals 0, all imaginary. That becomes your time modulation. Now, your lecturer is going to have to take about a 2-minute break. I got to go to the facility. Now, I have what a tunnel diode is. All right, we got one bright individual. How do you make a surface barrier tunnel diode? You take a piece of semiconductor material, silicon, germanium, gallium arsenide, it doesn't matter. Let's say it's P. No, let's say it's N. N is easy to make in the old days. You deposit, you take this and you etch it so it's absolutely flat, electrochemical etch, which means you take a jet and you put out a chemical, and then you take that conductive jet and you put a voltage source between it. And you etch, electrochemically etch, you use a chemical which is a salt of the semiconductor, and you electrically chemically etch an absolutely flat face that is molecularly flat on the surface of the germanium crystal. Then you shut that off. Then you put on top of that a metallic contact. Now, because of the electron pressure coming up here, hitting the barrier coming back, it builds a depletion region without putting any polarization across it. It builds a depletion region. Now, it's this thing with nothing has a depletion region. Now, if you put a current through this, what's it going to do? It's going to build up electrons on one side or the other side of the barrier. When you reach a particular point, they're going to punch through the barrier. But it's not a punch through, they tunnel. Remember, we built up a potential spatial charge, and as long as you don't exceed the charge across the barrier that the spatial charge represents, your current now is tunneling. It's not going through, punching through like a transistor does, where you combine the holes and the electrons. I don't expect this to be clear to everybody. This is essentially for technicians and engineers at this point. The people who understand, you're following at this point. Now, what's the characteristics of the tunnel diode? I versus voltage. It goes up, then it comes down, and it goes up again. This is your tunneling region here. What this is saying, as you increase the voltage, the current goes down, not up. That's your negative resistance. Any negative resistance device you can use as an amplifier. Now, let's go into what's actually happening in this depletion region. I'm going to take this point here and expand it. This is your indium contact. Here over is your germanium. This is the depletion zone. This is the germanium. This is the indium. Now, as you bring a potential this way, remember, Al was speaking of a rotating vector on the edge of a time. This is going to create a rotating vector on the edge of electron flow. You follow so far? This is the spinner and twister creating around the tunneling electron. What is this twister, spinner? It's a vortex. It's a vortex, folks. What is a vortex? A hole in our space-time continuum. Now, what happens if we put a Dirac delta pulse in this current flow? The vortex will instantly turn on, the vortex will instantly turn off. What has all the mathematics that we've gone through say when we take a vortex generation, turn it on, turn it off? You do a frequency to time transform. So the faster, the narrower you pulse this thing on and off, this now becomes a miniature time vortex, which means when it goes from this end to this end, it becomes electric current here. It's electric current plus a time current. So we got E here. Here we got E plus delta T. What we just learned? A tunnel diode is a delta T diode. Does the engineers and technicians follow so far? Now, let's go another step further. As I race, I'm going to talk. In 1952, the aliens contacted President Eisenhower and said, hey, we want to get together and talk with you. We all heard about our treaty with the aliens. One of the things they asked us to do is, we got this problem, we got a reliability problem of a very strange semiconductor device similar to your transistor that we use on our craft. We want to have you and Earth be this sector of our galaxy source for these devices. We'll show you how to build them. What did they show us how to build? No? Surface barrier transistors. The tunnel diode came out of the surface barrier transistor research. According to a friend of mine, let's call him Clark in the book, he worked for a company called the Electronic Transistor Company. In 1946, 1947, Osborne, Shockley, that crowd working for Western Electric had formed, at that point, in the 50s, Western Electric split up. The semiconductor manufacturing part of it split off, and it was essentially owned and run by Osborne, Shockley, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What did they call this company? The real name is the E.T. Company. They knew all along that the transistor developed by Bell Labs in the mid-40s was from the initial contact with the K group in the 30s. That was the first technology exchange. They gave us the crystal amplifier that we call the transistor. Now, they were hoping that at some point in the 50s, the ET involvement would be announced to the public, and they could capitalize on that their company is developing technology given us to us by the ETs. E.T. Company. Now, they were not at the point when they formed this. They weren't going to call it the extraterrestrial company. They had to come up with a name for the crystal amplifier. E, of course, is electronic. Company, of course, is company. They went through name after name after name for this device. They came up with one name, transistor, that had a T. So it became the electronic, transistor, company. This was the R&D production facility, used to be Western Electric. In other words, Philco, Sprague, RCA, General Electric, in those days did not have their own facilities. They bought all their devices from the Electronic Transistor Company. Of course, in the mid-60s, the Electronic Transistor Company became a public corporation. They put out a catalog about that thick. You could buy any old transistor you wanted from, even the discontinued ones. Now, the Philco Research Laboratory in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was run by Philco, the Electronic Transistor Company, and U.S. Navy. Clark tells a story that there was a man by the name, he called him Onopole, the man's real name is Annapolis, who was an officer in the E.T. company. Clark used to work for Annapolis when he was going to RCA Institutes. He tells his story that Mr. Annapolis, or as he put it, Onopole, would come in and told him, you know where these crazy little transistors you're working from came from? Clark says, oh no, I don't know. He said, well, he was assigned at that point to the Navy Philco Research Laboratory in Philadelphia. Now remember, we're talking 60s. This goes back to 1953. And that they took a back end of the plant that had the research facility in it, cordoned it off entirely, put all sorts of high security in there. They developed the surface barrier transistor in there, and this fellow told Clark that every day these tall characters would come in black trench coats, black hats, and like a mask over their faces. When they got in the back, they took the trench coat off, the mask, and the hat, and they were literally 7-foot-tall gray aliens. Clark said that Annapolis described the gray alien perfectly, and that the gray aliens were telling us how to build these transistors and helping us develop the manufacturing process. And this was surface barrier transistors. I think in a little bit Al can talk about what he psychically picked up they were doing with these transistors, but either way, let's now go in and consider, what is this transistor? We take our P-type material. P-type material is what, Mr. Engineer? A whole electron source. This is germanium semiconductor that is doped with an ion, which has excess electrons, so it's a source of electrons. I'm not going to go any deeper into semiconductor theory. Now, instead of having one electrochemical etch jet, you put two. And you have two batteries here. I don't know if the polarity of the batteries are correct. I don't care. And we smooth out two sides of the crystal. Yeah. It goes like this. I see somebody remembers the surface barrier electrochemical etching process. Stand up, sir. Let's have an applause for him. Now, once they do this, what do they end up with? Let's look at this little tiny piece here. I am the consultant today, the engineering and production consultant for the E.T. company, by the way. This is where I got all this information from. Now, you take one, you deposit the indium material on the etched surface. Now, you may put some other crud on here and call it MADT, call it MAT, call it SBAT. You know, the surface barrier transistor was owned by the government, and the ET company tried to capitalize on it, change the design a little, and what they would do is they would change the emitter junction. Now, what you have to consider is this. The spec sheets say that it resembles a PNP transistor. What's going to happen here? When you change the bias on the zone that is outside of the, what the hell they call, electron pressure generated depletion zone, you're going to move this. You're going to create vortexes, tunnels. We now have taken our tunnel diode and made a tunnel transistor. Now, what's going to happen here if we make a common emitter amplifier, ground this, I'm going to make it dotted because we're talking of AC ground. We put our pulse here, and we put our load here. We're going to control the tunneling between the emitter and the base, and the base and the collector. What's going to happen is the delta T current, based upon this pulse, is going to circulate this way. Which means now we're going to take our input signal and convert it to an electrical signal plus a delta T. This is your delta T amplifier. What do we do with this thing? Take this thing, connect it to, as Al was saying, a 555 with a current limiting resistor so we don't blow the hell out of the base. You can't get them. No. I lucked out because after the boss man gave me a pile of them, and then maneuvered me to give the pile back because he was told by the government, no, you can't do that. I remember seeing in the Allied radio catalog MADT transistors. So I got an old catalog, looked at it, opened up the page, sure enough, there it was. So who is Allied Radio today? Radio Shack. So what I did, I called Tandy in Fort Worth and said, hey, I'm interested in a product that you guys used to sell in the late 60s. I gave them the part number. They went into the computer. Oh, yeah, we got those, sir. We got 40,000 of them. So I say, well, how come we don't have them in the catalog? Nobody wants them anymore. We still got them in the warehouse. We don't throw anything away. So I say, well, send me some samples. So they send me about a dozen samples. Yeah, these things are surface barrier transistors. So I call them up, and I make a deal, and I buy all 40,000 of them. And I said to them, anyone else in the country you know of have any others? So I've called a few other small dealers, you know, associated dealers, allied dealers, and I got about another 1,000 on top of that. At this point, just as I did with radiosondes when I built the biosonde, I cornered the market on surface barrier transistors. If you go to ET company today and order them, although they got them, they're going to tell you they don't got them because there's legalities involved since the company was told in the 70s to destroy them all. They're not going to admit to anyone outside of the group, which I'm part of, that they have these transistors. So, where do you get surface barrier transistors? From Preston, right. This is how the delta T transistor works, and I'll give it back to Al now. Because what I did is 6 to 9 months ago, I handed out one of these little blue boxes I prototyped. Oh yeah, I forgot to describe the coil. What we're using is a coil with 4 pi windings, spider wound. Difference is, the bottom one is spaced further away. Just as Tesla noted, you could direct the direction of the flux by changing the spacing. So we got a coil with 3 closely spaced windings and a distant space winding, and the time flux goes this way through the coil. Well, somebody had to ask that. It's really complex. I know Al may want to refer to this, right? So I'm not going to erase this. You take your coil form. You rotate it. You take your feed, and it goes up and down each time it rotates. What you get is you build up a winding a little at a time, and you do 4 of these. Each one is called a pi winding. It's called pi because it goes from 0 to 360 degrees each time the form rotates once. And you just keep taking about number 60 wire, and you build it up. The whole impedance of this thing is about 1,000 ohms. The current through the transistor is maybe about 10 milliamps. The whole thing draws about 15 milliamps from a 9-volt transistor radio battery. And from that point, I'm going to give it back to our distinguished Eldridge survivor, Mr. Edward Cameron. Come on, Mr. Edward Cameron. As I said, I gave him one of...
I'll dig in my little goodie box here. And that's just where I put it. There it is. And I'll come out with a delta T generator. It's not a very big device. You can actually stick it in the coat pocket. The entire circuit, the coil, the battery, everything is in here. If you want to take a picture, you're welcome. And it has a little LED in the back to let you know that it's on. A huge photocapacitor to smooth out the current. I didn't show every detail of the circuit. It's not really necessary. But now we got a very interesting function on this. If I remember correctly, Preston, the surface with the 4 screws is the output side, right? Yes. Right. And if you turn it to where the little legs for this box are, it's a standard ordinary Radio Shack or whatever plastic box. That's the vacuum cleaner side. And also have here a little adjustment pot there in order to change the frequency. Right. Right. And the coil sits in here. Literally. All right, I have a little screwdriver in the case I think I can use. In any case, I don't know how many of you people are sensitives, but we're going to find out. Turn this thing on. It's now on with a little red light. See how many people feel anything. Anything at all. It's on. You know, those who are scientists and engineers usually are not too sensitive to subtle effects, we'll put it that way. Little red light says it's on. And some people have noticed if I turn it edgewise, I get a terrible headache. Not trying to suggest anything, but I want to see whether anybody feels anything in here. Okay, now if you turn it this way, it acts like a vacuum cleaner, a very strange vacuum cleaner. It doesn't suck dirt, doesn't suck air. It will react in a metaphysical manner. I have played with this thing now for some 6 months, more than 6 months, perhaps 8. And I found the frequency setting is fairly critical for some people. But if you have a problem with how shall I put it, an energy implant, not the solid crystal type which the aliens and or the government use, but an energy type implant, this device will pull it off the body. If you have problems with well, you could almost say ET attacks. If you have problems with entities of any type which are attacking you, this thing will usually end the problem. They don't like it. I've used it more than once for that purpose, including up in North Carolina recently, where we had an infestation of ETs at a certain symposium, which Preston and I and Duncan were at. They didn't like this thing at all. They left. They were not physically present in the sense of being you or I or anyone else in the physical, normal reality. They were present in an altered or a parallel reality. Now, this gets into a very interesting aspect, which I don't have time to cover fully, but very briefly. There is alternate realities. There are several of them. The government does have means to cross over into these other realities. There's a project called Project Winter Haven, which is developed parallel to the Montauk Project, probably under the cover of the Phoenix Project. And this is a project for interdimensional travel. And by using interdimensional travel techniques, some of these so-called spirits turn out to be quite real, because what is the spirit world but another reality? Quite physical to their own references. Your dream world is quite physical when you're in it. Therefore, one has to come up with a question: what is reality? We think we know what it is because we can hit a table. If you hit a car into a brick wall, you smash the car, you might smash yourself. If you could do an alternate reality shift quickly enough, you wouldn't hit the wall. Who knows what you'd hit in the other one? But this gets into a very strange and difficult area to analyze. What is reality? We accept ours as real because we've been educated to it. We feel it. We know it every day. But there are other realities, and other people there that know their reality as real. They probably look at us as ghosts, if you will. But there is occasionally crossover under certain conditions, dimensional changes, dimensional doorways, which can be artificially created, or naturally they exist without artificial creation. But a device like this can prove useful in terms of if you've got uninvited visitors that you don't like. Okay. We don't have it in production yet, and I can't really give a price. This is one experimental unit. Preston had built one or two others on a breadboard, which are about 5 times this, cover a 12 by 12 inch breadboard. But if we do get it in production, it's I can put it this way: it'll be more than $100 and it'll be less than $1,000. The circuit is fairly simple, but we have to consider a number of aspects: frequency stability, adjustability, durability. We still don't really know how durable that transistor is. It's a low voltage device, as most germaniums were in the past. Typically, a germanium had a VCE rating of about 10 volts, 9 volts to 12 volts, 15 was high. This is a 9-volt transistor. These are hand-picked to handle about 25 volts. And that's one of the unknowns at this point, is how stable is that transistor against transients. You won't get much transients with a big filter cap and a battery. But it might if you're in an area where, let's say, there was a powerful radar transmitter or some other very powerful electromagnetic transmitting device, anything from an FM transmitter to a TV transmitter. They'll put up a lot of voltage if you're too close. And if the circuit board happens to be critical in terms of the layout, the length of the leads, and you hit a quarter wavelength lead, you can build up a rather high voltage internally on a transistor because of the lead lengths on the board. Right, that's the other aspect. The coil is directly connected. Right. Okay, I'll see if I can find a screwdriver and take the lid off so you can see what it looks like. Practically, I've used it to end problems with people who had attacks of one kind or another. Energy attachments, one could call it, which is a form of implant, but is not a physical crystal type. Physical crystal types have to be removed surgically. Biological implants can be destroyed by electronic means. This is not powerful enough to do it. It can be used to stop a form of mind control where people are trying to impinge those who have the capability of transmitting a form of mind control. And I'm talking about hardware. I'm talking about mind control from another person's mind, who has the capability, impinge on a secondary party, bad energy, feeling bad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, one can do a number on those people which breaks it and gives a person back some peace. Then you have to look at the other aspect of who is this and why are they doing it. Yes?
Have you done any experiments with, like, time anomalies? Does it change the rate of time?
It changes the rate of time in a very localized area because the output is a cone of energy. And since time is one of those elements which is basic to the universe, it does not know a distance limitation, even with a small box like this. There is no 1 over d squared or 1 over d attenuation. There is no attenuation. Sorry? What does he... It is localized because of the size of the coil at this point on the edge of the box. It fans out as a cone. It fans out as a cone of energy. The further you go, the more it spreads. But it does not attenuate insofar as any tests I have made on it are concerned. I've had people that pick it up and are sensitive to it 2,500 miles away from Phoenix to the East Coast. I'm sorry? Nope, haven't had any so far. There's not enough power. You would have to have a very large delta T function for that, and a considerable amount of power, more than a 9-volt transistor battery. Perhaps something which is charged by a 12-volt car battery might do it. Yes? It is basically a psychotronic type device, psychotronic effects, yes. And in that sense, the effect is not physical insofar as any effective tissue is concerned, so far as we can determine at this point. We have not yet built a detector which can directly measure the output of this thing. We're working on that. And that's another aspect. If we say we got something coming out of here, we've got to be able to prove it. We can prove it indirectly by the subtle effects that some people pick up, but that is not hard proof. That's very soft proof. Oh. Right. If you have this thing properly modulated, it will affect the person that way. If you put a scramble signal on there, there's no telling what it can do to a person's mind if there was enough power. So the government knows how to manipulate these things. They use mind control devices all the time. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I had it on the vacuum cleaner side, which says it was pulling and then it stops pulling, and that's probably what you felt, the end of the pull. Now, not everybody can feel this device. Anyone else that had a feeling for it? You did. Anyone else? Okay. It says that there was a low percentage here, but at least there were 3 or 4 who did feel it. 5. You have a question? Okay. Transmitting device, receiving communications. Very definite possibility, but one has to have a detector in order to demodulate, in order to use it as a useful transmission of intelligence device. You want to have 2 links, a transmitter and receiver. This is a transmitter only, and we do not have any modulating techniques on this. It is strictly a square wave generator driving it. Yes?
This is maybe a question more for the rest of it, but why couldn't one use a field effect message, which has very narrow base?
Well, field effect radius is not help.
Yeah, that's a very special function.
The tunnels is what makes this work.
Yeah.
This is a tunnel.
My experience with those type of devices, or those type of diodes and transistors, is that they're very sensitive, and if you place them in a properly machined cavity, you can get bandwidth up to 300 gigahertz.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Gun diodes, right. They seem to have disappeared from the market. There are many things you can do with the properly built germanium devices you cannot do with silicon. And this is a technology which has been almost forgotten and buried, but probably not in certain government circles. Anyway, you have another question? Okay.
Earlier in the presentation, you said you were going to mention what happened to the vessel that was sold to the Greek Navy.
Yes, it's interesting you did bring that up. Some interesting feedback on that recently. The feedback has come back to us recently about the fact that it is still in the Greek Navy, and that over a period of years the Greeks have had a few strange things happen. They found a number of locked rooms, which they could not get into until they forced locks. They had some closets or standard type ship's lockers. They finally forced one open, and a skeleton fell out. And they found wiring all over the ship that goes nowheres. It's just sitting there unconnected, and tons of wiring apparently with no connections to anything, and they don't know what it is. Well, I think I do. All right, so I think we all do by now. But that's some of the feedback on that. I've heard other wild stories about when they first had the ship, they were getting some very anomalous effects which caused them to almost strip the ship and repaint it completely before they felt the stuff would, whatever it was, die down and they could go out to sea with it. The stories are anecdotal and they don't have any first-hand evidence or proof of it. Yeah, they want it for a museum piece. Ho, ho, ho. There'd probably be a cutting torch applied to bury it forever. That is also in the communications we have. The government would like to get it back. One other question? Okay. In the back.
It would appear to me that in 2023, that the Alberts might disappear, regardless of whether you have machinery on there or not.
Well, there is no machinery on the Eldridge now other than a normal complement for a warship. Why do you pick 2023? Oh, 3, okay. It's an interesting thought. It didn't go into 83.
But, you know, when you went back to cut the wire, cut the cable, you were at a particular angle between 0 and 90 to do that. So what does it say that the spin as it rotates slightly, you have to back to the
Yeah, that's an interesting thought in terms of alternate realities and repetitive cycles and all of that. We've explored that thought-wise, and we do have reason to believe that we probably have been through this circuit more than once. But that's something we don't go into now because we're not sure of it. That's an interesting thought. Thanks. Yes? No. No, almost all of that type of device has been withdrawn from the market. Very nice little neat widgets. And the gun diode disappeared for about the same reason. Today you have a restricted market in terms of what electronic devices are available to the general lay public or the general experimenter. I haven't seen or heard of any, and I know somebody who's been trying to locate them. Maybe they're surplus. Whatever. Okay. Well, I think that's about the end of our talk here. I will get a screwdriver and take the lid off the box, but I will thank you very much for your attendance and your interest.
This is unsolicited testimony